What if the forest you trusted was hiding a darkness older than time itself? Erica Nolan thought she was just a wildlife officer until the Blackwater Basin revealed its true nature. A place where shadows wear the faces of the lost, and every whispered name pulls you deeper into the nightmare. Bound by ancient rules and haunted by echoes of the vanished, Erica must confront the terrifying truth that survival means more than just staying alive. It means fighting a hunger that feeds on fear itself. Will she keep her light burning or become just another shadow in the hollow? I always thought I knew the forest. That's what I told myself every damn morning, lacing up my battered work boots before dawn broke across the Montana sky, mixed with something old and wet, like the breath of a crawl space no one has dared enter in 50 years. That smell hit me the first night I worked the graveyard shift at Midnight Creek Gas and Rest Stop, right smack in the Nevada desert. I remember pushing open the heavy glass door just before midnight, the door creaking like it hadn't been oiled since Nixon was president. The smell rushed at me like a slap. For a second, I thought I'd walked into a slaughterhouse instead of a rundown gas station. The neon open sign flickered like a dying heartbeat, and above it, a swarm of moths battered themselves into oblivion against the buzzing blue light. Inside, a single humming fridge held rows of flat sodas and expired sandwiches. They sure as hell don't hear the whispers. I remember the exact morning everything started unraveling. The smell of black coffee mingled with the chemical tang of DEET on my jacket. The weak sun, filtering through the kitchen window, painted gold lines across my cluttered table. Field notes, mug rings, a stack of unpaid utility bills. I thought about Liam, my colleague. Just a kid really, 25, bright-eyed, fresh out of Boise State. He had that naive belief that nothing bad ever happens to the good guys. We'd shared plenty of awkward truck rides up to Echo Basin, that weird stretch of swampy lowland at the southern tip of Blackwater. Locals avoided it. Even the game trail seemed to stop cold, like animals knew better. Liam didn't come home 2 nights ago. Officially, they labeled him missing in action. In reality, that meant he vanished into the trees and no one had the guts to admit he might not come back. That morning the call came in. Erica, my supervisor's voice crackled through the radio. Old, tired, a ghost of what it used to be. Echo Basin needs a sweep. You're the only one left on the roster today. I hesitated. Echo Basin. The phrase alone made my stomach turn. It wasn't on any public trail map. There was a joke among rangers. If your compass points you south of Basin Road, kiss your ass goodbye. I grabbed my pack anyway, because that's what we do, right? We move forward. We put on the badge and walk into the darkness, even when the hairs on the back of our necks scream, run. I parked the Forest Service SUV at the edge of Basin Road. The whole area was heavy with a weird stillness, like the air was holding its breath. A low fog crept through the pines, threading between trunks like pale fingers. I stepped out. The smell of wet moss and distant smoke filled my lungs. It should have felt comforting, like a homecoming. Instead, each step felt like wading into a lake at midnight, unseen shapes waiting under the surface. My boots crunched over a carpet of fallen needles. Every few feet, a faint rustle hinted at unseen watchers in the underbrush. My breath caught every time. About half a mile in, I paused. The forest felt wrong. Not wrong like a predator nearby or a sudden change in wind. Deeper, as if I'd stepped off the map into some place that didn't quite belong to our world. A crow watched me from a crooked branch overhead. Its eyes were dark mirrors, and I swear for a second I saw my own reflection, looking terrified and small. I forced myself forward, deeper into Echo Basin. About an hour in, I found it. Liam's backpack. It sat perfectly centered on a mossy boulder, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. The straps were neatly buckled, the fabric clean despite the surrounding mud. Next to it, a folded Park Service hat with Liam's name embroidered in small black letters. I crouched, fingertips brushing the damp brim. My heart thudded so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. I didn't want to believe it. My radio crackled again. Erica, do you copy? Report your position. I pressed the button, but my mouth stayed shut. I couldn't speak. I felt eyes on me, but I saw no one. Then the smell hit me, a sweet, rotting odor. Not quite death, something older, more primal, like the stench of a hollow log that has hidden secrets for centuries. I rose to my feet, scanning the tree line. Something shifted between the trunks. A blur of pale gray, a figure, a trick of the light. A low hum rose, almost too low to hear. My ears strained to make sense of it, but it felt less like sound and more like a presence, crawling along my skin. I backed away, but my heel snagged on a root. My balance gave out and I slammed down onto the forest floor, mud splattering across my face. A voice, soft, so solid, slipped through the trees. "Erica." I froze. My lungs turned solid. "Erica, help me." Liam's voice, but it wasn't. Some instinct screamed at me that the voice was hollow, like an echo bouncing through 1,000 hollow skulls before reaching my ears. I scrambled to my feet, chest heaving. My eyes darted everywhere, nothing but shifting mist in those dark pines, their arms reaching skyward like frozen screams. I forced my legs to move, adrenaline burning through my veins. My boots sank in the mud as I bolted up the narrow ridge toward a higher clearing. I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst onto a rock outcropping, I dropped to my knees, gasping, choking on air that felt thick and electric. I looked down at my shaking hands. My palms were streaked with mud and blood, tiny cuts I hadn't noticed in the scramble. My fingers trembled as though they belonged to someone else. I thought about Liam, his jokes about energy bars, his clumsy attempts at learning bird calls, the way he used to look at me, eyes bright, hungry to learn. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. Somewhere below, the fog shifted. I caught a flicker of movement, a silhouette in a park ranger uniform, stumbling through the trees. "Erica? Please." "No." I turned away, pressing my forehead to the cold rock. I clenched my teeth until my jaw ached. I wanted to help him. God, I wanted to help him. But that thing wasn't Liam. Not anymore. My radio buzzed again. "Erica, report in now!" I grabbed it with a shaking hand. I found something," I croaked. My voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger. I think I saw him, or something like him." Silence. Then, "Get out of there, right now," but I knew it wasn't that simple. I looked back down into the forest, the trees below shifting like restless animals. Somewhere in that living labyrinth, a shape wearing Liam's face waited. I pulled in a ragged breath, feeling my own heart beat like a drum against my ribs. I had to go back. I had to understand. And even as a part of me begged to run, I knew I was already past the point of no return. The drive back to base felt like a dream stitched together by half memories and road noise. Every bump in the dirt track rattled my bones. My fingers were locked so tight around the steering wheel that my knuckles burned white under the fluorescent overhead light of the SUV. I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but my mind kept drifting back, Liam's voice echoing from the fog, the smell of rotting sweetness, the figure in the trees. I pressed my teeth into my bottom lip until the taste of iron filled my mouth. By the time I reached the ranger outpost at Blackwater, the sun had already begun to sag behind the ridge, turning the sky into a smear of rust and ash. I parked, killed the engine. My breath fogged up the windshield even though it was still warm out. I stared at the distorted reflection of my own face in the glass, wild-eyed, smudged with dirt and something darker. I didn't want to move, didn't want to open that door and step into the reality waiting inside. But a voice in my head, my dad's voice maybe, snapped me out of it. "Get up, keep moving. No one's coming to save you." The moment I pushed open the door, the dry evening air swallowed me whole. Inside, the outpost hummed with quiet unease. The overhead lights flickered like dying fireflies. Someone had left the coffee machine gurgling, a faint burnt smell curling through the hallway. I found Chief Warden Harris at the big pine desk in her office. Her hair was tied back tight, streaks of gray woven into a severe braid, lines cut deep into her forehead. She had that look of someone who'd spent decades watching the woods swallow people whole and never gave herself permission to cry. She looked up, her eyes pinned me like a hawk to a mouse. "Sit," she ordered. I sat. My knees threatened to buckle, so I kept my hands jammed between them. "You saw something," she said. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Her hand shot out, sudden, startling. She slid a thick manila envelope across the desk toward me. Its flap was torn and yellowed as though it had been opened and resealed 100 times. On it, scrawled in large, blocky letters, "Nolan." My breath hitched. "This was left for you," Harris said, her voice flat and cold as stone. "By the old warden, before he went missing." I stared at the envelope. I didn't want to touch it. My fingers itched like they'd been stung. Harris leaned forward, her elbows digging into the desk. "You need to read it. Now." I swallowed and reached for it. The paper felt heavier than it should, almost damp. My thumb hesitated on the edge. I pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. It smelled like wet soil and old fires. At the top, in a typewriter font, "Operational Guidelines for Blackwater Basin Restricted Sectors." My heart slammed against my ribs. I forced my eyes down the page, reading each line over and over as if my brain refused to accept them. 1. Do not enter Echo Basin alone after sunset under any circumstance. 2. If you hear your name, respond only if you can see the person's entire face. 3. If you see a figure resembling a colleague or friend more than once in a single patrol, do not approach. Return immediately. 4. Never follow lights or sounds off marked trails, no matter how familiar they seem. 5. If you find a circle of stones, sticks, or bones, do not disturb. Do not mark the location on your map. Memorize only. 6. Do not whistling inside Blackwater after dusk. If you hear whistling, do not investigate. 7. Always return to base before 4:30 p.m. No exceptions. By the time I reached the last line, my skin felt too tight for my bones. Harris watched me, her jaw working side to side like she was chewing on a bad piece of jerky. "Those aren't just suggestions, Nolan," she said, voice low, almost a growl. "They're survival instructions. You break them, you don't come back." "Not really." I shook my head. "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't we know?" She slammed her palm on the desk, making me flinch. "Do you think we want to talk about it?" she spat. "Do you think it's easy to tell young recruits that the woods aren't just home to bears and cougars? That there are things in there wearing your friends' faces like party masks?" Her voice cracked. For a moment, she looked impossibly small behind that huge desk. I let the paper slip from my hands. My eyes fell to the floor, tracing the deep grooves worn into the pine boards, grooves from generations of boots pacing the same anxieties. "Liam," I said softly. She closed her eyes. "He was a good kid." "He's still out there," I whispered. She looked up sharply. "No. Whatever you saw today, whatever called your name, that wasn't Liam anymore." My pulse roared in my ears. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her she was wrong. But deep down, somewhere cold and dark, I knew she wasn't. I thought back to the figure in the fog, the perfect mimicry of his voice, the way it twisted when it spoke, like a recording played underwater. "I have to go back," I heard myself say. Harris's eyes went wide, then narrow. "You'll do no such thing," she hissed. "That's exactly what it wants. It wants you to break protocol, to wander off trail, to give it an opening." I stood. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. "There has to be a way," I said. "Some kind of ritual, or search, something." Harris rose too, her chair screeching backward. "We don't have rituals, Nolan. We have rules. Rules that keep us alive." I grabbed the sheet again, my fingers digging into the paper until it crumpled. "What if these aren't enough?" I said, my voice shaking. "What if these are just half the truth?" Harris's face paled. For a moment, her guard slipped. Something like guilt or fear, maybe both, flashed in her eyes. You think I don't know that? She whispered. We stood in silence, the only sound the distant groan of the wind pushing at the windows. Finally, she stepped around the desk and placed a hand on my shoulder. I've lost 12 good officers to Echo Basin in the last 15 years, she said. Your father, he was one of them. Her fingers tightened. My throat closed up, my vision tunneling. He left me that envelope, she said, her voice growing rough. Told me to pass it to you when the time came. I was hoping it never would. My chest felt like it was caving in. Harris let go and backed away, her eyes glistening under the office lights. You need to decide what kind of warden you want to be, she said. The kind who follows orders and survives, or the kind who runs headfirst into the dark for answers they might not come back from. I wanted to speak, to scream, but no words came. She turned away and stared out the small window, facing the tree line. The last rays of sun were dying behind the pines. The forest looked blacker than pitch, a giant mouth waiting to swallow everything. I looked down at the paper again. The 7 rules stared back, each line feeling like a nail driven into my skull. I knew what choice I had already made. My fingers curled around the envelope as I stepped out of Harris's office. The hallway felt longer than before, each fluorescent light overhead buzzing and popping. My boots echoed like gunshots against the scuffed floor. In the locker room, I swapped my jacket for the heavy Ranger parka, slipped my father's old knife into my belt, feeling its familiar weight settle against my hip. Outside, the wind howled low and mournful through the empty parking lot. I glanced once at the tree line, my breath turning to fog in the cold. I thought of Liam, his stupid jokes, his wide grin after a long patrol, the bright spark that had always made me think he'd outlast us all. And for a moment, I could almost hear him again. Erica, please. I closed my eyes, and I stepped forward into the dark. The trailhead to Echo Basin felt like a grave marker. By the time I reached it, the last shred of daylight had dissolved into a gray bruise above the treetops. My headlamp cut a thin, trembling beam into the darkness, but the forest beyond swallowed it like a mouthful of smoke. My breath steamed out in ragged bursts. Each inhalation felt sharp, like I was pulling ice shards into my lungs. I paused at the sign, half rotted, the words Echo Basin Restricted Area barely visible beneath decades of rain and moss. Someone had scratched a single word in the wood beneath it, deep enough to splinter. Run. I touched the carved letters with the tip of my glove. A shiver ran up my spine, as if something inside the wood had shuddered in response. My radio crackled on my hip. Hera's voice spilled through, distorted and sharp as a blade. Erica? Don't go back in. Listen to me. If you step beyond that sign, you're on your own. No rescue. No help. I pressed the button, my thumb trembling. I know, I said. I'm not coming for help. I'm coming for him. Silence. Then a single word from Harris, low and final. Godspeed. I clipped the radio back to my belt. My hands flexed around the handle of my father's old hunting knife. The weight of it felt like an anchor, or maybe a promise. I stepped over the line. The forest didn't roar to life. It didn't scream or lurch. It simply accepted me, as though it had been waiting all along. With every step, the undergrowth seemed to close in tighter. Pines leaned over me, their branches like skeletal fingers weaving a ceiling. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves pressed around my head, thick enough to taste. I kept my headlamp pointed forward, scanning every inch. Shapes flickered at the edge of the beam, twisted stumps that looked like crouched figures, mossy rocks that shifted when I glanced away. Somewhere behind me, a branch snapped. I spun around so fast my shoulder cracked. The light swung wildly, catching nothing but the fog that had begun to creep between the trunks. I clenched my teeth, kept moving. 100 yards in, I found the first marker, a ring of stones arranged in a perfect circle. I froze. The rules. Rule 5. If you find a circle of stones, sticks, or bones, do not disturb, do not mark the location. Memorize only. I didn't need to mark it. It was seared into my mind now. A flicker of movement just beyond the stones. I saw it, a silhouette, tall and narrow, leaning against a tree like a tired hiker. Erica, The voice was as soft as moth wings. "Please, don't leave me." I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 5. When I opened them again, the shape was gone. My heartbeat thundered in my ears so loud I barely heard the new sound that rose through the basin, a low, rolling hum, like a choir singing from underwater. I forced myself to take another step, then another. I don't know how long I walked, time bent in those woods. Maybe an hour, maybe 10 minutes. Each moment felt like it stretched and contracted, a heartbeat echoing into infinity. Then I saw it, Liam's backpack, exactly where I'd left it earlier. The same mossy boulder, the same unnaturally clean fabric. But this time, something else. A trail of footprints. I moved closer, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The prints were fresh, almost impossibly so. Long, deliberate strides leading deeper into the trees. I followed. After a few dozen yards, the footprints split. One trail led left, deeper into thicker brush. The other curled right, up toward a narrow ridgeline. I crouched down, studying them. Both sets looked identical. Same tread, same depth, a perfect copy. I remembered the rule 1 of 3. If you see a figure resembling a colleague or friend more than once in a single patrol, do not approach. I swallowed hard. My mind screamed to turn around, to obey, to run, but I couldn't. I chose the right trail, up the ridge. My father always said, when in doubt, take the high ground. I don't know if that was about war or about life, but it felt like a lifeline now. As I climbed, the wind shifted, carrying a smell I will never forget. A sickly sweet scent of decay and flowers blooming out of season. I crested the ridge and found myself staring into a shallow clearing, moonlight dripping through the branches in fractured silver lines. At the center stood Liam. Or what looked like Liam. His uniform hung loosely on his frame, like it had been draped over a mannequin. His eyes glowed faintly, milky and unfocused. His head twitched to the side, then jerked back upright as if a puppeteer had yanked invisible strings. Erica. His mouth opened, but the sound that came out wasn't a human voice anymore. It was a chorus, a dozen voices piled on top of each other, each one slightly off. My legs locked in place, my mouth went dry. I lifted the knife, though I didn't remember deciding to do it. Liam's body shuddered. One of his arms twisted backward, joints cracking like dry twigs. His head tilted too far, neck stretching until tendons glimmered in the moonlight. Then he stepped forward. Help me. I could move. I wanted to. Every cell in my body screamed to run, but something inside me, some old, unyielding part, kept me planted. The figure took another step. I realized, with a cold certainty, that it wasn't just mimicking Liam's shape. It was wearing him like a stolen coat. I thought of all the stories my father told me when I was little. Stories I thought were just his way of scaring me into caution. The skinwalkers, the spirits that echo voices to lure the lost deeper into the woods. I thought about the rules, and I broke them. I stepped forward. The figure stopped. Its head twitched, a jagged, unnatural movement. The voices stopped mid-howl. We stood like that, me knife raised, and it skin draped loosely, moonlight glimmering off its 2 white teeth. A wind rushed through the clearing, scattering pine needles in swirling arcs. Somewhere in that wind I heard my father's voice, not as a memory, but as something alive. Don't give it your fear. It feeds on your fear. I pulled in a shaking breath. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. Then I took another step. The thing tilted its head again. Its mouth opened wider, wider until it split at the cheeks, revealing a yawning, dark void inside. I raised the knife, and in that moment, something behind those eyes flickered. Something that looked almost like pain. I don't know how long we stood frozen like that. Then it turned. Slowly, deliberately, it shambled toward the deeper woods, each step echoing like a stone thrown into a bottomless well. I stayed still until it disappeared into the blackness. Then my knees gave out. I collapsed onto the cold ground, the knife slipping from my hand. My breaths came in ragged, broken sobs. I wasn't sure if I'd just survived or if this was the first step into something far worse. But I knew one thing with a terrifying certainty. This was just the beginning. When my breath finally slowed, I forced myself back onto my feet. My legs trembled like I'd just run a marathon in a snowstorm. The knife lay on the ground, its handle slick with cold sweat and dirt. I picked it up, feeling the old leather grip bite into my palm. Around me, the clearing had gone silent. Even the wind had stopped its endless whispering, leaving behind a vacuum so deep it pressed against my eardrums. I turned in a slow circle, my headlamp sweeping over the tree line. Each branch looked like a claw, each shadow a waiting hand. My brain screamed to turn around, to head back to the ranger station, to find Harris and barricade myself behind locked doors. But a different voice, quieter, deeper, kept me moving forward. I thought of Liam again, the flicker in his eyes, that flash of something almost human, almost begging. I had to know if there was a piece of him left to save. I staggered out of the clearing and stumbled down the ridge, crashing through brambles and fallen branches. My parka snagged and tore, leaving a trail of dark fabric like a breadcrumb path behind me. At the base of the ridge, the trees widened into a shallow basin. Fog pooled low, hugging the forest floor like a living skin. Moonlight glimmered off it in long, thin ribbons. I scanned the ground, heart pounding. Then I saw it. Another circle. This one was different. Not stones, but a ring of broken branches and bleached animal bone. In the center sat an old ranger hat, caved in as if something had crushed it from above. I knelt at the edge of the circle, fighting the urge to vomit. The smell here was even stronger than before, a heavy mix of wet earth and something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit left in a sealed jar. I reached forward on instinct, but stopped myself an inch before touching the hat. Rule 5. Do not disturb. Memorize only. I drew in a shaky breath and burned every detail into my mind. The arrangement of bones, the sharp angles of the snapped branches, the perfect symmetry. I was about to stand when I heard the sound. A low hum. At first it was so soft I thought it was my own blood pulsing in my ear, but then it grew louder, vibrating in the ground beneath me, rolling up my bones until my teeth rattled. I spun, knife raised. Something moved between the trees, tall and thin. It drifted, almost gliding, each motion so smooth it made my stomach lurch. It stopped just at the edge of my headlamp's beam. I couldn't see its face, only the vague suggestion of limbs and a neck too long for any human. The hum shifted into something like speech. Erica. The voice was wrong, layered, like 5 people whispering into a metal can all at once. Erica, you shouldn't be here. I gripped the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. Who are you? I spat. My voice broke halfway through. The figure tilted its head in a series of jagged clicks, as if testing the concept of curiosity. We watch. We remember. You break the circle. I didn't break anything, I snapped. The hume turned into a wet, rattling laugh, a sound that made my stomach clench and my vision pulse. You will. A sudden gust of icy wind tore through the basin, flattening the fog and tossing pine needles into the air like a storm of dark confetti. The figure leaned forward, stretching as if its body were made of molten rubber. A thin hand, longer than any human's, emerged from the blackness, reaching toward me. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the circle. The hand stopped inches from my chest, fingers twitching and curling like worms in the sun. I could see thin membranes between the bones, almost translucent under the moonlight. It hovered there, trembling, as if waiting for permission. Some primal part of my brain screamed, "Move!" I turned and ran. My boots pounded the soft earth, splashing through hidden puddles and tripping over roots. My breath came in ragged, burning gasps. Behind me, the forest erupted into sound, branches snapping, the hum turning into a chorus of shrieking echoes. I didn't dare look back. I crashed through a wall of thorns, ignoring the tearing pain across my arms and legs. Somewhere far behind, I heard the shriek shift into something almost like laughter. I burst into a small clearing and dropped to my knees, clawing at the mud. My fingers dug so deep they closed around stones and worms and cold water. I screamed, a sound raw and animal, echoing into the trees until it dissolved into silence. When I finally looked up, the forest was still again. The fog had receded, and above me the moon had begun to slide behind a shroud of thin clouds. My entire body trembled. I glanced at my arms. Dozens of thin cuts oozed dark lines of blood. My parka was torn to shreds, my pants soaked through. A single thought hammered at my skull. You're not supposed to be here. Not after dark. Not alone. I forced myself to stand, every muscle screaming in protest. My headlamp flickered once, twice, then steadied. At the edge of the clearing, I saw a shape moving slowly between the trees. My heart slammed so hard I thought I might faint. But it wasn't the creature. It was Harris. She moved with a limp, one arm cradled to her chest. Her eyes met mine, wide and feral under the dim beam of my light. "Harris," I choked out, stumbling forward. She held up her free hand, palm out. "Stop," she croaked. Her voice sounded like gravel dragged across metal. I froze. Her lips trembled. They followed me. I tried to warn you." A tear cut down her dirt-streaked cheek. Behind her, the dark shifted again. Shapes, multiple now, emerged. Taller and thinner than any man. Their movements fluid and nightmarish. "They know you're here," Harris whispered, her eyes begging me to understand. I can fix this," I said. But even as I spoke, I heard the lie in my own voice. She shook her head, her breath hitching. "No, you can't. You can only survive." A low groan rose from the figures behind her, like a distant landslide echoing through a canyon. Harris turned her head slowly, her expression blank. One of the shapes stepped closer. Then, in a single motion too fast to track, it enveloped her. Her scream, sharp, guttural, ripped through the clearing. I staggered backward, bile rising in my throat. My vision fractured as tears blurred the world into shards of gray and white. When I looked again, she was gone. Only silence remained. I fell to my knees, my mind roaring with static. I didn't know how long I knelt there, shaking and sobbing into the mud. But eventually, I rose. My knife felt impossibly heavy in my hand. My legs felt like glass ready to shatter. I turned back to the trees, the hum already growing again in the distance, and I stepped forward. I don't remember how long I wandered after Harris vanished. I moved like a ghost through the forest, half conscious, my feet scraping over gnarled roots and rocks. My headlamp flickered above me, casting erratic shadows that writhed and twisted like living things. Somewhere inside, a voice kept whispering, "It's over. Go back. Save yourself." But that voice sounded thin and fragile, like a spiderweb stretched across a canyon. Another voice, deeper, older, colder, had started to grow louder. A voice that told me I had gone too far to turn around. My hand shook around the knife. Mud caked my fingers. Blood smeared across my sleeves. Every breath burned like acid in my throat. I don't know how many circles I passed, rings of stones, bones, or twisted sticks. Each one felt like an accusation, like the forest itself was trying to count how many times I'd broken its rules. At some point, I found a narrow game trail, winding uphill toward a ridge I didn't recognize. Every step felt like my legs might buckle. The air was thin, full of the smell of moss and rotting bark. At the top of the ridge, I stopped. Below me, the forest spread out like a black ocean, fog rolling and curling over it like waves. The moon had retreated behind thick clouds, leaving only the weak glow of my lamp to push back the dark. Then I heard it again. "Erica." It was Liam's voice, but different this time. Less hollow, less warped. I scanned the tree line, heart hammering. "Liam!" I shouted, my voice cracking in the freezing air. A shape stepped out from the trees below. This time it really looked like him. His posture was slouched, his arms hanging at his sides. His ranger jacket hung loose on his shoulders. I could see his face clearly in the weak light, his eyes wide and frightened, his lips trembling. He took a step forward, then another. I felt something inside me snap. I bolted down the ridge, crashing through underbrush and scraping my shins raw. Branches slapped at my face and arms, but I barely felt them. "Liam!" I gasped, stumbling to a stop a few feet away. He looked up at me, eyes filling with tears. "Erica," he choked out. "It's me. I swear, it's really me this time." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. I moved closer, my knife dropping to my side. He staggered forward, arms outstretched, and then I saw it. A faint shimmer behind his eyes, like moonlight on oil. His lips twitched at the corners, stretching wider than they should have, for just a fraction of a second before snapping back. I stopped. My entire body went rigid. His hands froze mid-reach. His eyes darted back and forth, as though checking if I'd noticed. We stood like statues, the forest humming quietly around us. I raised the knife again. His expression collapsed into something desperate, almost human. His mouth opened, but no sound came out this time. Behind us, a low groan began to rise. It built slowly, like a distant avalanche, until it rattled the ground beneath my boots. Shapes emerged from the tree line, one after another, dozens of them. Tall, thin, their faces empty hollows that stretched and shrank with every pulse of that inhuman groan. They moved in perfect silence now, slipping between trees like liquid shadows. Liam, or the thing wearing him, turned his head sharply toward them. No!" he shrieked, but it sounded torn, like his voice was fighting to come out through layers of static. "I'm not ready. She's not." One of the figures lunged forward. In an instant, they were on him. Long, pale hands closed around his arms, his chest, his face. They yanked him backward, deeper into the shadows, his scream cutting off so suddenly it felt like a blade had sliced the air itself. Then they turned toward me. I backed away, my knife trembling so badly I could barely keep it pointed forward. The largest of them stepped into the moonlight. Its form rippled like water, shifting from tall and spindly to wide and monstrous. Its skin shimmering between textures, bark, flesh, something scaly and iridescent. It opened its mouth, and inside I saw not teeth, but a swirling void, a tunnel into some impossible darkness. A voice crawled out, deep and many-layered, echoing across the clearing. "Erica, you were never meant to see this. You broke the circle. You broke the circle." I shook my head violently, stumbling backward. "I didn't. I just wanted to help him." The creature took another step forward. Every inch of its movement felt wrong, as though each bone shifted and reset between moments. "You took the wrong path, and now you must finish it." I turned and ran. My feet tore across the clearing, roots clawing at my ankles. I could hear them behind me, dozens of them now, their movements a horrifying symphony of snapping twigs and that low, endless groan. I burst into another ring of stones, nearly tripping over the uneven ground. In the center lay an old tin lantern, still burning weakly with a bluish flame. I snatched it up without thinking. As soon as my fingers closed around the cold metal handle, the groaning behind me paused. I turned, breath ragged, sweat and blood soaking my face. The creature stood at the edge of the circle, swaying. The flame flickered violently, sending pale blue sparks into the air. The shapes hissed, shrinking away as if the sparks burned them. One stepped forward, testing the edge. The flame flared again, brighter this time, and it jerked back, its hollow face twisting in silent agony. I realized, in a sudden electric jolt of clarity, that the lantern was a ward, a weapon, or at least a barrier. I held it higher, stepping backward slowly. They watched, heads tilting, hands twitching. I moved until my back hit a tree. My chest heaved, my entire body shaking so hard I thought my bones might shatter. The creatures stayed where they were, watching, waiting. In the dim light of the lantern, I saw my reflection in the glass. Wild hair, blood-soaked clothes, eyes wide and haunted. Something inside me shifted. I understood now. This was never just about Liam, or Harris, or even the rules. It was about me. About what I was willing to risk, about how far I was willing to walk into the dark to find the truth. The largest creature raised a hand, slow and deliberate. Its fingers curled into a beckoning motion. I tightened my grip on the lantern, pressing it to my chest. For the first time, I felt the whisper of something stronger than fear burning in my gut. Defiance. I looked into the creature's hollow face and spoke, my voice low and sharp. "You want me? Come and get me." The blue flame flared, roaring upward. The forest howled in reply, and I stepped forward. The moment I stepped forward, the forest erupted. The creature shrieked in unison, an unholy wail that ripped through my bones and set every nerve on fire. The sound was a hurricane of agony and rage, echoing through the pines and crashing back against my skull. But I didn't stop. I held the lantern high, its pale blue flame guttering and flaring as though alive. Sparks burst and vanished in the dark, illuminating glimpses of their twisted forms. Arms that bent backward, heads that split and reformed, flesh that shimmered between bark, scales, and raw muscle. They surged toward me, hesitating at the edge of the circle. I could feel their hunger vibrating in the air, like 1,000 knives scraping against glass. I took another step, then another. Every inch forward felt like wading through concrete. My muscles screamed. My lungs burned. Then one of them broke rank. It lunged, slicing across the circle in a blur of claws and jagged limbs. I swung the lantern on instinct. The flame exploded in a flash of violent blue light, splattering across its form like molten metal. The creature shrieked, so high-pitched my vision went white. It collapsed to the ground, convulsing, its skin bubbling and sloughing off like wet paper. The others recoiled, a wave of hissing and shuddering. I stumbled forward, tears burning my cheeks. My voice tore from my throat, raw and wild. "Get back! Get the fuck back!" My words echoed, bouncing from trunk to trunk, swallowed by the trees. The creatures clustered at the edge of the flame's reach, shifting and twitching in a grotesque dance of anticipation and frustration. I could see them almost clearly now, impossibly thin necks, hollow eye sockets that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. One tilted its head, slow and deliberate. It raised a long, spidery arm and pointed deeper into the woods. For a split second, I hesitated. Then I understood. They wanted me to follow. A trap. It had to be. But deep inside, something else urged me forward. A whisper in my blood, echoing my father's words. "Don't give it your fear. Move. Finish it." I tightened my grip on the lantern and stepped beyond the circle's boundary. They parted for me, a narrow corridor opening through their ranks. As I moved past, they shivered and clicked, hands flexing and faces twitching as if straining to hold back their true forms. My boots crunched over dead leaves and wet moss. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation stabbing at my ribs. I followed the narrow passage deeper, deeper. The trees began to twist around me, their trunks bending at impossible angles, branches weaving overhead like ribs in a giant rotting cage. The air thickened, sticky and sweet, each breath carrying the stench of decay and old smoke. Finally, the corridor opened into a clearing I had never seen before. At the center stood a massive stone circle, ancient and cracked, its surface crawling with lichen and strange spiraling carvings. In the center of the circle, a pool of black water shimmered under the lantern's glow, and there, kneeling at the edge of the pool, was Liam, or what was left of him. His head hung low, his hair matted with blood and mud. His hands clawed at the edge of the stone, as though trying to drag himself away from the pool's pull. My voice caught in my throat. "Liam," I croaked. His head twitched up. Slowly, painfully, he looked at me. His eyes were sunken, hollow, like two dry wells. But somewhere, deep inside, I saw a flicker of something at recognition, pleading. "Erica." His voice was a broken reed, each word a struggle. "Don't come closer." I stepped forward anyway, my heart splintering with every movement. The creatures followed behind me, closing the circle. Their shapes seemed to melt and shift, merging into the trees, the rocks, even the fog. They watched silently, waiting. I knelt beside him, setting the lantern on the stone. Its light spilled across the pool, revealing shapes moving beneath the surface. Faces, hands, forms that pressed against the water as though trying to break free. Liam's fingers clutched my wrist, his nails digging in. His skin felt icy and wrong, but I held on. I thought I could fight them," he rasped. "I thought I could hold on. But they're stronger. They always were." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I'm here now," I said. "I'm going to get you out. We'll find a way." He shuddered, convulsing violently. A thick black ooze leaked from the corners of his mouth. His eyes rolled back, and for a moment his body went limp. Then his head snapped back, and he screamed. It wasn't just Liam's voice. It was every voice I'd heard since stepping into Echo Basin. Harris's, my father's, dozens of others layered together, echoing inside my skull. The pool's surface erupted, spraying me with freezing black liquid. Figures clawed their way halfway up, mouths yawning impossibly wide, teeth like needles. Liam's grip tightened, pulling me toward the water. I grabbed the lantern and thrust it between us. The blue flame roared to life, a blinding column of light. Liam shrieked, his body jerking back. The figures in the pool recoiled, hissing, their claws scraping the stone. I forced myself to my feet, holding the lantern high. The flame flickered wildly, casting violent shadows across the clearing. Liam looked up at me one last time. His lips trembled, forming silent words I couldn't understand. Then his form began to dissolve, slowly, like paper burning from the edges inward. His eyes locked onto mine until the last shred of him vanished into the swirling black. The pool went still. The forest around me exhaled, a single long, shuddering breath. The creatures at the edge faded into the trees, slipping away like a bad dream dissolving at dawn. I collapsed to my knees, the lantern clattering beside me. My chest heaved, my lungs on fire. I wanted to scream, to tear my own skin off, to run until my legs gave out. But instead, I stayed. I stayed and listened to the silence that spread across the clearing, a silence so deep it felt alive. Finally, I looked into the lantern's flame. It burned steady now, no longer flickering. Somewhere in its glow, I thought I saw Liam's face. Soft, young, peaceful for the first time. I pressed my forehead to the cold stone and let the tears come. Above me, the first rays of dawn began to break over the twisted treetops, staining the fog with pale gold. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I wasn't the same, and I knew the forest wasn't done with me yet. I don't know how long I sat there in that clearing after Liam was gone. The dawn kept creeping up, slow and tentative, like it was afraid of what it might find among the twisted trees. Thin lines of gold and pink threaded through the fog, turning the black pool into a mirror of bruised light. Eventually, I stood, my knees cracked like old branches. I picked up the lantern, now burning a steady pale blue, quiet, almost serene. My fingers curled around its handle as if it had grown into my bones. I staggered out of the clearing, back into the maze of trunks and shadows. Every step felt like wading through thick oil. My mind replayed Liam's face in the flame, his final look, relief and surrender, and something else I couldn't name. Somewhere along the trail, I realized I was heading toward the old ranger station. Not the main outpost, but the first cabin built when Blackwater was declared protected land decades ago. They said no one used it anymore. Too old, too far out. Some of the newer officers joked it was haunted. I didn't believe them. Until now. I broke through a wall of underbrush, and there it was, a squat, mold-duct cabin, sagging under the weight of years. Its roof caved on one side, the chimney choked with moss. The front door hung crooked on rusted hinges. I hesitated at the threshold, lantern held high. Inside, the air was heavy with mildew and dust, but beneath that was another smell, something metallic, sour, almost sweet. The scent of old blood. My boots crunched over rotting papers and shards of glass. The floor creaked under me like it might give way at any moment. On the far wall, I saw a line of metal filing cabinets. Each drawer was warped and dented, paint peeling in long curls. My gut twisted, but I forced myself forward. The top drawer stuck at first, then gave way with a shriek that cut into the silence like a bone saw. Inside, stacks of manila folders, all yellowed and brittle at the edges. Names scrawled in black marker: Miller, J. Thomas, K. Harris, M. My fingers shook as I flipped through them. Reports of disappearances, partial remains, sightings of unidentified figures. Each folder heavier than the last, each photo a punch to the chest. One photo showed a group of new recruits, smiling, young, bright-eyed. Harris stood at the end, arm around a boyish face I recognized immediately: Liam. Underneath, a caption in neat handwriting: Class of 2018, Blackwater's future protectors. I swallowed the bile clawing at my throat. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. Ritual diagrams, crude circles drawn in thick charcoal, labeled with unfamiliar words. Lists of offerings, sketches of shapes with elongated limbs and eyeless faces. A page fell loose, landing at my feet. I bent to pick it up. A letter, handwritten in shaky cursive. To whoever finds this. If you're reading, then you've already broken the first circle. You've seen them, heard them. They don't kill because they're hungry. They take because they're curious. Because we are the anomaly in their forest, not the other way around. We thought rules would keep us safe, but the rules are just a trade. They take some, they leave the rest alone. I tried to tell Harris. She wouldn't listen. If you're smart, you'll burn this place and run, but if you're like me, you'll want answers. You'll go deeper. God help you. It wasn't signed. My hands trembled. The lantern's flame flickered as though echoing my pulse. I dropped the page and stumbled back, crashing into another cabinet. The drawers slammed shut around me, as if the building itself was trying to bury the truth. I turned and fled into the next room. Inside, a dusty metal bed frame sat beneath a broken window. On the wall above it, dozens of Polaroids were pinned in a chaotic collage. Each photo showed a different person, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, some I recognized from the files. All of them stood in the forest, alone, their faces blurred or distorted. In every photo, a faint shape loomed behind them, sometimes in the shadows, sometimes so close it nearly touched them. A scrawl of marker ran across the wall, looping and jagged. It learns your shape, fine. It learns your words. It learns your heart. I backed away, my heart jackhammering. My mind reeled, connecting all the pieces like splintered glass rearranging into a mirror. The rules weren't protection, they were a pact. An agreement to keep the basin fed so the rest of the forest remained safe. I thought of Liam, of Harris, of my father. My father. I remembered his voice in the wind, the way he always paused before Echo Basin on our old patrols. His haunted eyes when he handed me the knife for the first time. He knew. A violent rage rose in my throat, hotter than fear. I wanted to tear every photo off the wall, to smash every drawer, to scream until the basin itself cracked open and spilled its secrets. Instead, I stepped closer to the wall, studying each image one last time. At the center, partially hidden by others, was a Polaroid I hadn't noticed before. I reached up and pulled it free. It showed me. I was standing alone in a clearing, my headlamp bright against the black. Behind me, an enormous shape curled up from the trees, thin arms outstretched, touching my shoulders like a lover's embrace. My stomach twisted into a knot of ice. My vision swam. The lantern's flame surged again, blue light flaring so brightly it cast long shadows that danced along the walls. The house groaned around me, timbers popping and cracking. Outside, I heard the forest roar to life, an orchestra of clicks, hums, and whispers, echoing from every direction. I shoved the photo into my pocket, turned, and ran. As I burst from the doorway into the half-light of morning, the woods felt different. The air buzzed, charged like the moment before a lightning strike. Shapes slipped between trees at the edge of my vision, always just out of reach. I knew now that there was no going back. No ranger station, no rescue team, no Harris waiting to chew me out. There was only forward. I tightened my grip on the lantern, the Polaroid heavy against my heart. I had to finish it. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and grief and rage, a new feeling took root, something dangerous and electric. Resolve. I stepped into the trees. The forest closed behind me. The forest swallowed me whole. I didn't even hear the door slam shut behind me. The trees shifted so quickly it felt like the walls of a living maze closing around my shoulders. I moved forward, half running, half stumbling, my breath ragged in the cold air. The lantern's blue flame bobbed wildly with each step, throwing thin slices of light that caught on slick moss and twisted roots. Every few seconds a shape darted at the edge of the glow, long fingers, empty sockets, the wet shine of teeth. They didn't attack. Not yet. They watched. I felt their hunger in the hush between my footsteps. I felt it crawling along my spine, whispering promises I couldn't quite hear. Somewhere ahead, deep in the shadows, a sound drifted out. A song. At first, it was low, just a single humming note, like someone tuning a cello at the bottom of a well. It slid up and down in pitch, winding its way around the trees like a snake. I slowed, listening. The melody shifted. Words began to shape themselves in the song. I pressed my free hand to my ear, trying to block it out, but it crawled under my skin, vibrating in my teeth, behind my eyes. I stumbled forward, nearly pitching face first into a hollow log. My knee slammed into a root, sending a shock of pain slicing up my thigh. I bit down on a scream. When I looked up, I saw a figure standing on the trail ahead. It was Harris. She looked exactly like she had the last time I saw her. Mud-caked uniform, torn jacket, eyes wide and broken. "Erica," she croaked, reaching one trembling hand toward me. "You have to stop. Please." I backed away, my breath catching. "Erica, listen to me," she pleaded. "They're using you. You're the final piece." I raised the lantern. The flame flared, casting her face into a mask of deep shadows. For a split second, the illusion wavered. Her mouth split at the sides, her eyes blackened into twin pits. I let out a strangled gasp. The creature hissed, its head jerking violently before it vanished back into the dark. I collapsed to my knees, shaking. My hand pressed the lantern to my chest so hard I felt my heartbeat echo against the glass. I wanted to close my eyes, to sleep, to wake up anywhere else, anywhere but here. But I forced myself up, step by step, using the knife as a cane when my leg threatened to buckle. The song rose again, stronger now, echoing from every direction. I realized I wasn't on any known trail anymore. The forest around me had changed. Trees clustered impossibly close, their trunks twisting together like wet ropes. Patches of strange fungus glowed a sickly green along the bark, and the ground pulsed faintly under my boots, as though breathing. I pressed on, guided by something deeper than reason. A shape appeared ahead. An archway formed from two massive pines, their branches knitted together overhead. Symbols were carved deep into their bark, spirals, eyes, claw marks. The song poured from beyond the arch like a flood. I hesitated, every part of me screaming to turn back. Then I felt it, the Polaroid in my pocket, burning hot against my ribs. I pulled it out. My own face stared back, pale and hollow-eyed, the towering shape behind me, frozen mid-reach. I clenched my jaw. I stepped through the arch. Instantly, the air changed. Warmer, thicker, so dense it felt like moving underwater. The song wrapped around me, filling my head with static and warmth and an aching nostalgia that didn't belong to me. Memories not mine flashed in my mind. Faces I didn't know, places I'd never been, voices calling out in languages I didn't speak. I staggered forward, my vision flickering. The trees thinned, opening into a clearing unlike any other. At its center stood a massive stone altar, crusted in moss and dark streaks. Around it, hundreds of tiny totems, bones, feathers, twisted twigs, hung from thin cords, turning slowly in the thick air. I could feel them watching. All of them. The ground around the altar was littered with footprints, some boot-shaped, some bare, some inhumanly long and narrow. Blood stained the moss in dark constellations. I stepped closer. On the altar, I saw another lantern, identical to mine. Its flame burned a deeper blue, almost violet, and inside it swirled shifting shapes, faces, fingers, things I couldn't fully understand. I knew without knowing that this was it, the center, the source. The creatures began to emerge from the trees, one by one. They formed a loose circle around the clearing, their bodies melting and reforming as they moved, their faces opened and closed, empty holes gaping and swallowing moonlight. The song rose into a fever pitch, vibrating through my bones, churning my stomach. I stepped to the altar, my own lantern lifted. The flame inside it twisted wildly, flickering between shapes, reflecting all the fear and rage inside me. The other lantern pulsed, calling to mine. I felt something shift in the dirt behind me. A final voice rose from the crowd of creatures, a voice that sounded like every person I had ever loved, every friend, every enemy, layered into a single impossible chorus. Erica, finish it. Complete the circle. I looked at the two lanterns, my heart thudding so hard it blurred my vision. I understood then. They wanted me to merge them, to surrender my flame, my will, myself, to seal the pact forever. For a moment, I felt myself leaning forward, drawn by the warmth and the promise of release. Then, deep inside, another echo, my father's voice, hoarse and distant. Don't give it your fear. Don't give it yourself. I froze. My grip on the lantern tightened, my jaw locked. No, I whispered, my voice so low I barely heard it myself. The chorus shrieked, a sound so violent it split the night, shaking branches free from the trees. I stepped back from the altar. The creatures lunged forward, their hands clawing at the air, their faces warping in outrage. I raised my lantern high, the flame bursting into a roaring pillar of light, their forms staggered, twisting and buckling under the brilliance. I let out a raw, animal scream that tore from the bottom of my lungs, and I turned, running back through the archway, the blue inferno lighting my path as the forest screamed behind me. I ran like my soul was on fire. Behind me the forest roared, branches snapping, roots tearing free, the collective screech of the creatures rising into a hurricane of sound. My boots pounded over moss and mud, my legs burning with each desperate stride. The lantern's blue flames surged, illuminating my path in an almost blinding arc. Shadows lunged at the edges of the light, hands stretching out from the trunks, mouths gaping wide enough to swallow the moon. I crashed through the underbrush, ducking under low-hanging limbs that felt like claws trying to drag me back into that clearing. The song wasn't gone, it followed me, warping into a furious, discordant wail. It called my name in endless, broken harmonies. Erica? Erica, Erica, Erica. I forced my mind to stay sharp, one foot in front of the other. Breathe, move, live. Somewhere in the chaos, I saw movement ahead, a figure moving quickly between the trees. At first, I thought it was another mimic, another trap. Then I heard it, a sharp whistle, two rising notes. That sound, my father's old signal when he wanted me to come home from the yard. I didn't stop to think, followed. The figure moved fast, weaving through trees with impossible grace. I stumbled after, heart threatening to crack open in my chest. The forest around me changed again. Trees grew closer together, their trunks bulging and splitting into strange tumor-like knots. Thick vines, slick with black sap, curled across the ground, grasping at my ankles. I hacked at them with my knife, each swing spraying sticky filth onto my face and arms. The flame above me hissed as droplets landed on the glass. I kept moving. The figure ducked into a narrow passage between two massive oaks, and I followed, squeezing sideways, scraping my shoulders raw. Beyond, I burst into an open hollow. Moonlight poured down in sharp, almost surgical beams, revealing a series of half-buried stone markers scattered across the clearing. Shapes were carved into each one: spirals, eyes, crude outlines of human hands. The figure stood in the center, back turned. I slowed, panting, knife and lantern both raised. "Who are you?" I rasped, voice raw and shredded. The figure turned. It was my father, or the shape of him. He looked just as he had the last day I saw him alive. Tall, lined face, eyes heavy with secrets he never shared. His old ranger hat perched crooked on his head, casting a long shadow over his face. "Erica," he said softly, "you shouldn't be here." My arms trembled, the lantern almost slipping from my fingers. "You're not real," I spat. "You're just another one of their tricks." He didn't flinch. "Maybe," he admitted, voice low. "But maybe I'm also the last piece of you they can't touch, the part that remembers who you are." Tears blurred my vision. "I don't believe you," I said, but my voice cracked in the middle. He stepped closer. "I tried to warn you years ago, those quiet mornings on the ridge, the way I never let you walk too far alone. You thought I was just overprotective, but I knew. I knew the basin doesn't just take your body, it takes your will, your heart." I backed away, shaking my head. "No, you left me. You never explained. You just vanished." His eyes softened. "I wanted to protect you from the truth, from the pact. But now you've seen too much. And they want you because you're strong enough to end it, or become part of it forever." The song rose again, echoing off the stones, weaving itself into my bones. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head. "Make it stop!" I screamed. My father knelt in front of me, his ghostly hand hovering inches from my cheek. "It only stops if you choose," he whispered. "You can surrender, merge with them, complete their circle, or you can finish what I started, destroy the heart of the basin." I looked up at him, vision smeared with tears and sweat. "How?" I choked out. He pointed at my lantern. "The flame inside you is the last untainted spark. That's why they want it. But it can also cleanse. It can sever the link. If you reach the source..." His words cut off abruptly. A screech split the hollow. I looked up, just in time to see a long, needle-thin arm pierce straight through my father's chest. His face froze in a silent scream as the shape dragged him backward, dissolving him into a fine black mist. I stumbled to my feet, horror clawing at my throat. A towering creature stepped into the clearing. Its body was a patchwork of stolen pieces, human torsos, twisted animal limbs, bark, bone. Its head split down the middle, revealing a pulsing core of dark, roiling light. It shrieked, the sound making my ears bleed. I raised the lantern. The flame roared, throwing blue arcs across the stones. The creature recoiled, its form convulsing and collapsing in on itself before reforming. I realized then, this was the heart, the nucleus of the basin's hunger. It lunged. I swung the lantern, blue fire crashing into its torso. The creature staggered, black ooze hissing where the flame touched. It swung again, claws raking across my side. Pain tore through me like a red-hot blade. I fell backward, my elbow smashing into one of the stone markers. The lantern nearly slipped from my grasp, but I clutched it tight, holding it close to my chest. The creature screeched again, advancing, its hollow face opened wide, preparing to engulf me. Summoning every shred of strength left, I pushed up, lunged forward, and jammed the lantern into its open maw. The flame exploded outward in a blue supernova. I screamed with it, my voice and the flame merging into one endless roar. The creature convulsed violently, its patchwork form splitting and melting, its light sputtering and dying. Around me, the forest screamed in unison, a final, dying wail that shook the world. Then silence. I fell to the ground, chest heaving, blood seeping through my fingers. My vision narrowed to a single point of fading blue light in the lantern's core. I reached for it with trembling hands. Inside, I saw a face. My face, but stronger, clearer. I felt a rush of warmth spread through me, not from the flame but from somewhere deeper, older. I realized I was still alive, and for the first time in what felt like centuries, I felt free? I don't remember falling. One moment, I was standing over the creature's collapsing form, the lantern's blue flame bursting from its mouth like a dying star. The next, I was on my back, staring up at the canopy above me, if it could even be called that anymore. The sky above the hollow was torn open, a jagged gash of blackness fringed with shreds of moonlight. It looked like a wound in the universe itself, pulsing faintly as if it were alive. I tried to sit up. Pain flared through my ribs and side where the creature's claws had torn me open. My hand instinctively pressed against the wound, and I felt warm blood leaking between my fingers. Every breath was a firestorm, every heartbeat a hammer blow. But I was alive. That realization hit me like a tidal wave. I pulled the lantern toward me. The flame inside had shrunk, flickering weakly, no longer the raging inferno it had become during the fight. I lifted it closer. Inside I saw a shimmer, my own reflection, but not as I looked now. The face was calm, determined. My eyes were clear, unafraid. I looked like someone who had finally stopped running. A wave of exhaustion rolled through me, so heavy I nearly blacked out. My head lolled to the side, and I saw the creature's remains. The thing that had been the heart of the basin lay in a collapsed heap, like wet paper left out in the rain. Its patchwork skin had melted into a black sludge that slowly soaked into the earth. Steam rose in gentle curls, carrying the smell of rot and something almost floral, like lilies left too long in stagnant water. Beyond it, the trees stood motionless, as if stunned into silence. The usual whispers, creaks, and rustling, gone. A deathly hush settled over the entire forest, so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. For the first time since stepping beyond that cursed sign at Echo Basin, I felt alone. Truly alone. I crawled to the altar stone, dragging my leg behind me. Every inch felt like climbing a mountain in a hurricane. When I reached it, I used my last ounce of strength to haul myself upright, leaning heavily against the cold, mossy surface. The totems that had once spun in a slow, hypnotic dance now hung limp. Feathers drooped, bones cracked and crumbled into dust. I pressed my forehead to the stone, the lantern cradled against my ribs. My breath rattled in the empty air. Memories flooded me in a rush. Liam's final look, Harris's desperate warnings, my father's haunted voice. Every rule I had broken, every circle I had crossed. A sob broke loose, ripping its way out of my chest. I didn't fight it. I cried for Liam, for Harris, for my father, for all the nameless rangers whose faces blurred together in those Polaroids. I cried for the girl I used to be, the one who thought the forest was a friend, a sanctuary. I cried until my voice gave out and my tears ran dry. When I finally looked up, the first hint of dawn painted the sky in gentle streaks of lavender and peach. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance, hesitant, like they were testing whether the world was safe again. I turned my gaze back to the lantern. The flame inside had steadied, no longer wild or frantic. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat. A strange calm settled into my bones. I stood on shaking legs. The forest around me felt changed. Emptier, yes, but also lighter, like a terrible pressure had been lifted. I stepped forward. As I moved through the trees, the hush gave way to small, cautious sounds. The rustle of a squirrel darting up a trunk, the distant call of a mourning dove. It felt like waking up from a nightmare so long it had started to feel like the only reality. Eventually, I reached the old trailhead, the same place I had crossed so many lifetimes ago. The sign still hung crooked, moss creeping up its splintered edges. The word "run" was still carved deep into its surface. I paused, staring at it. I thought about carving something new beneath it, some final message for the next poor soul. But what could I possibly say that would make any difference? Instead, I raised the lantern. The flame flared once, then settled. I stepped beyond the sign. The air felt different immediately, crisp, real, untainted. I sucked it in greedily, my lungs burning with relief. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the tree line, listening to the faint echo of the basin's last breath. But I knew as long as when I finally turned, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. A ranger truck idled behind them, headlights cutting two pale beams through the early morning mist. I squinted. It was a young woman, uniform too big for her narrow shoulders, hair pulled into a tight bun under her cap. She held a clipboard against her chest like a shield. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Ma'am, are you Erica Nolan?" she stammered, voice shaky but sharp. I opened my mouth, but no words came out at first. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming for a lifetime. Finally, I managed to nod. She rushed forward, stopping a few feet away when she saw the blood smeared across my clothes, the deep claw marks along my side. "Oh my God," she breathed. We thought you were dead." I looked down at myself. "Not dead," I croaked. "Just changed." Her eyes flicked to the lantern. "What is that?" she asked. I looked at it, really looked, for the first time since the clearing. The blue flame glowed steadily, somehow both gentle and impossibly powerful. "It's a reminder," I said softly. She frowned. "A reminder of what?" I met her gaze, my voice steadier now, each word dropping like stones into a quiet pond. "That there are things out there we can't control, things that don't follow our rules, and sometimes we don't need to fight them, we need to understand them, or end them." She swallowed, her fingers gripping the clipboard tighter. I stepped past her, my boots crunching on the gravel. The morning sun finally broke over the horizon, spilling gold across the forest behind me. I didn't look back. Not this time. They loaded me into the back of the ranger truck like I was some rare half-wild animal they weren't sure how to handle. The young ranger, her name tag read M. Calloway, sat next to me, her eyes darting between my blood-caked side and the lantern resting in my lap. Every time I shifted, she flinched, as if she expected me to lunge at her. The truck rumbled to life and crawled away from the trailhead, bouncing over potholes and loose gravel. I watched the trees slide past, each trunk like a silent sentinel, their secrets sealed behind 1,000 layers of bark and moss. Calloway finally cleared her throat. Do you need a medic?" I glanced down at my wounds. The bleeding had slowed to a thick, sluggish ooze. My entire side was numb, and my shirt had fused to the gash. "I'll live," I muttered. She hesitated. "What happened out there?" I looked at her, really looked, at her trembling hands, her pale knuckles, the sweat gathering at her hairline despite the morning chill. "You wouldn't believe me," I said softly. She swallowed hard, eyes dropping to the lantern. "Try me." I turned my gaze back to the window, the forest blurring into smears of green and gray. "It's older than us," I began, my voice low and careful. "Older than the trails, older than the maps. We thought we were caretakers, protectors, but we were just tenants. The forest let us stay because we fed it, sacrificed without even realizing. The rules, the missing rangers, the vanishings. It was all part of a pact." She shivered beside me, her breath catching. "And you broke it?" she asked. I laughed, sharp and humorless. "No, I finished it." Silence swallowed the cab, only the engine's low growl filled the space between us. We turned off the old access road and into the main ranger compound. A few buildings squatted in the clearing, steel roofs glinting under the rising sun. A group of uniformed rangers stood near the main lodge, their heads snapping up as we approached. Calloway slowed the truck to a crawl. The moment we stopped, she jumped out and signaled to the others. They rushed forward like a swarm of ants, surrounding the open door. One older man, white beard trimmed military short, climbed into the back with me. His badge read Chief Warden Abel. His eyes narrowed when he saw my face, and then the lantern. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "Nolan, we thought you were gone. We've been searching for days." The word rattled inside my skull. Had it really been days? Time in the basin had bent and twisted until it was unrecognizable. Hours felt like minutes, minutes like centuries. Abel's hand hovered over my shoulder, but he didn't touch me. His eyes flickered to the lantern again. "What is that?" he asked. I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "The end," I said. "And the beginning." He frowned, deep lines cutting into his forehead. "We need to get you inside," he said finally, voice low and uncertain. "Get you checked out, get statements. There'll be questions, lots of questions." I didn't argue. 2 rangers helped me out of the truck, their hands hesitant, as if they expected me to vanish into mist at any second. They guided me through the lodge's front door and into a small, sterile medroom that smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. They sat me on a cot and began fussing over my wounds. I barely felt the sting of peroxide or the tug of thread as they stitched the deepest tears. My eyes stayed locked on the lantern, its soft blue flame dancing in my lap like a heartbeat. A young medic paused mid-suture, staring at it. "Is that burning?" he whispered. "Leave it alone," I snapped, sharper than I intended. He recoiled, nodding quickly before returning to his work. Outside the window, more rangers gathered. Some peered inside, their faces pale and strained. I saw Calloway standing off to the side, arms wrapped tight around her chest, eyes wide and unblinking. When they finally finished, Abel stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He approached me slowly, pulling a folding chair across the floor so it screeched against the tiles. "You've got everyone on edge," he said, his voice low and tired. "They've all heard stories, bits and pieces, but no one ever came back to confirm them, until now." I didn't respond. My thumb traced lazy circles across the lantern's warm glass. Abel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Tell me everything," he said. I looked up at him, and for a moment I saw my father's face overlaying his, lined, haunted, weary from carrying too many secrets. I took a long, shuddering breath. "I saw the heart," I began. "I saw what it wants. It doesn't just eat us. It learns us, wears us, turns us into echoes of ourselves. The rules were never protection. They were sacrifices. Every vanishing, every unexplained death, every broken ranger. It was feeding." Abel's mouth twitched, his eyes darting to the lantern. "And you stopped it?" he asked, voice breaking slightly. I thought of Liam dissolving in my arms, of Harris screaming as the forest consumed her, of my father's final warning echoing inside my skull. "I think so," I whispered, "but I don't know what that means for the forest, or for us." Abel sat back, rubbing a hand across his face. For a moment he looked impossibly small. Finally he stood, his hands trembling slightly. "We'll have to investigate," he said, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe his own words. "Containment reports, state oversight." I laughed, a brittle, cracked sound. "There's no containing it," I said. "There never was. You can't box up a ghost. You can't fence in an idea. It's older than any map you've got in that office." He flinched, as if I'd struck him. A long silence stretched between us. Finally he turned to leave, pausing at the door. "If there's anything we can do," I shook my head. "You can listen," I said. "And maybe, for once, tell the truth." He stared at me, eyes heavy, then nodded slowly and stepped out, closing the door behind him. I sat alone, the lantern's flame reflecting in my eyes. Beyond the window, the forest stood silent, waiting. I knew this wasn't over. Not really. A new understanding settled into me, cold, sharp, but also strangely comforting. I had carried the basin's secret into the open, and now it would watch what I did next. I held the lantern closer, its warmth seeping into my bruised ribs. I wasn't just a ranger anymore. I was the last witness, the last keeper. And somewhere inside me, a dangerous thought took root. Maybe the forest wasn't done with me yet. The first night back at the ranger compound felt like being trapped in someone else's dream. They gave me a private room at the far end of the lodge, a small space with wood-paneled walls, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a single window overlooking the tree line. The lantern never left my side. I set it on the nightstand, its blue flame a quiet pulse in the dark. Every few minutes it flickered and threw ghostly shadows across the walls, long, sinuous shapes that reminded me of the creatures in the basin. I tried to sleep, but each time I closed my eyes I saw them. Liam's face dissolving, my father's final warning, Harris's empty gaze as she was pulled backward into the dark. I jolted awake over and over, my breath ragged, my fingers clawing at the sheets. Outside, I could hear the lodge coming alive in hushed fragments, boots scuffing against the porch, radios squawking in static, low voices murmuring in urgent tones. They didn't know what to do with me. I was a puzzle they couldn't solve, a wound they couldn't stitch closed. Sometime after midnight, a soft knock came at my door. I didn't answer. The door creaked open anyway. Calloway stepped inside, her silhouette framed by the hallway's dim light. She looked smaller without her hat, her hair falling in damp strands around her face. Can I come in?" she asked. I didn't move. She took a careful step forward, eyes glued to the lantern. "They're all talking," she whispered. "They say you burned the heart of the basin, that you might have killed it." I barked out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Killed it?" I spat. "No, I might have wounded it. But something that old doesn't die. It waits. It learns. It grows." Calloway's eyes filled with tears. She dropped to a crouch beside my bed, her hands twisted together in her lap. "Hey, you?" she choked. "Why did it have to be you out there? Why not me, or Abel, or any of the others?" I turned to her slowly. "It was always going to be me," I said. My voice felt like it came from somewhere else, deep and hollow. I was born into it. My father carried it inside him. He passed it to me. Every silent patrol, every unfinished story, every look he gave me when I asked about the basin. She reached for the lantern, hesitating inches away from the glass. "Is it alive?" she asked, her voice trembling. I looked at the flame. It pulsed softly, as though breathing. For a moment, I thought I saw an eye open inside it, watching me, watching her. "It's a piece of it," I murmured, "a shard of its will. Or maybe it's a piece of me now. I don't know where I end and it begins anymore." Calloway's hand fell away, her shoulders slumping. "What do we do?" she asked, so quietly it was almost lost in the creak of the old walls. I felt something shift inside my chest, a cold, steely resolve cutting through the exhaustion and grief like a knife. "We learn," I said. "We stop pretending the basin is just a collection of trees and trails. We stop writing the missing off as accidents. We face it, document it, and maybe we stop feeding it." She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for any hint of comfort. "And if it comes back?" she whispered. I reached for the lantern, cradling it in both hands. "Then we finish what I started," I said, my voice turning hard. A tear slipped down Calloway's cheek. She nodded once, as if to anchor herself in the moment, then stood and backed toward the door. She paused before leaving, her hand on the frame. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think you're cursed. I think you're the first one who saw it clearly enough to fight." I didn't answer. When she closed the door behind her, silence flooded the room again. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the flame. Images flickered across its surface, faces, shapes, twisted limbs. They shifted too quickly for my mind to hold, but each one felt familiar, as though I had always known them deep in my marrow. A voice rose inside me then, soft, "Careful, Erica." I flinched, nearly dropping the lantern. The voice didn't echo like the forest mimics. It didn't twist itself into my father's tones or Liam's broken cries. It was my own voice, but deeper, older. "You can end this," it whispered, "or you can become it." A shudder rolled through me, head to toe. "You can be the last guardian," it continued, "or the first heir." The words coiled around my mind, tightening like a vine. I wanted to scream, to fling the lantern through the window, to watch it shatter and spill that impossible blue flame into the night. But I didn't, because deep down some part of me, some dangerous, treacherous part, wanted to listen. I set the lantern back on the nightstand, my hands trembling so badly I thought my bones might crack. I lay back on the thin mattress, my breath ragged, sweat pooling in the hollow of my throat. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane. A chorus of branches groaned in reply, as if the entire forest was shifting closer, listening. I turned my head to the lantern one last time before forcing my eyes shut. The flame pulsed once, twice. Then, so softly I almost missed it, I heard my own voice inside the glass. "Rest now. Tomorrow, we begin." And for the first time in days, or maybe years, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I opened my eyes, the room was flooded with pale morning light. For a moment, I forgot where I was. I lay still, staring at the wooden ceiling above me, listening to the soft creaks and pops of the lodge settling into the day. Then my eyes drifted to the nightstand. The lantern sat there, its blue flame burning steady and quiet, like a watchful eye. Memories crashed into me all at once. Liam's scream, the black pool, the chorus of voices clawing at my mind, my father's ghost, the final rush of blue fire devouring the heart of the basin. I sat up too fast. Pain lanced through my ribs and I winced, clutching my side. The stitches tugged and a thin line of blood soaked through the bandages, but I barely noticed. The door creaked open without a knock. Calloway stood there, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. Her eyes widened when she saw the blood, but she didn't step back. "I brought you coffee," she said carefully, like she was offering food to a cornered animal. I nodded, my throat dry and raw. She stepped inside, set one mug on the nightstand next to the lantern, and handed me the other. I wrapped my hands around the ceramic, savoring the burn against my palms. We sat in silence for a long while. Calloway finally spoke first. "They're scared," she said, voice low. "They keep asking questions about what's out there, about you, about the lantern." I sipped the coffee, bitter and strong enough to make my eyes water. "They should be scared," I said. "Fear means they'll finally pay attention." She hesitated, chewing her lip. "And you? Are you scared?" I looked at her, really looked. Her face was pale, lips chapped, dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept either, but her gaze held steady, curious, determined, fragile. "No," I answered. "I'm beyond scared now. I'm something else." Her fingers tapped against her mug. "What do you mean?" I turned toward the lantern. The flame flared gently, as if it heard her question. "When I was in the basin," I began, my voice low and shaking, "I saw everything. The pacts, the sacrifices, every ranger who vanished, every soul it claimed. They're still in there, pieces of them echoing forever, and it knows us better than we know ourselves." I paused, feeling the words crawl up my spine. "But it made a mistake. It let me get too close. It showed me its heart, and I survived. Now I have a piece of it." Calloway swallowed hard. "So what does that make you?" I held up the lantern, staring into the blue flame. "A bridge," I said finally. "A new kind of keeper. The basin's whisper is in my blood now, but so is my father's defiance. I don't belong to it, and it doesn't own me. I can use this to end it for good, or to guide it, to decide who walks into the dark and who gets to walk back out." The words felt like jagged stones in my mouth, but once they were out, I felt lighter. Calloway's eyes darted to the flame, then back to me. "Are you planning to go back?" she asked. I nodded. "Not yet," I said. "First I need to make new rules. Ones that don't trade lives for safety. Ones that don't leave good people to die screaming in the fog." She set her mug down, leaning forward, voice trembling. "What if the forest doesn't accept your rules? What if it fights back?" A slow smile crept across my face, cold and sharp. "Then I fight back harder," I whispered. A sudden gust rattled the window behind us, and both of us jumped. Calloway shivered, hugging herself. I set the lantern down and stood, testing my weight on my leg. Pain flared, but I embraced it. It was proof I was still here, still human. I limped to the small dresser, rummaging through the drawers until I found what I needed. An old spiral-bound notebook, the cover warped and stained from years of use. I flipped it open and picked up a pen. At the top of the first page in bold, shaky letters, I wrote, "New rules for Blackwater Basin." Calloway watched, wide-eyed as I scribbled below, "No ranger enters alone, ever. No voices answered after dusk, even if they sound like family. Lanterns stay lit at all times inside the perimeter. Circles are marked, mapped, and watched. Not feared, not ignored. Any sign of mimic activity triggers immediate evacuation, no exceptions. The basin's stories are documented and shared. The forest survives on silence. It starves on truth. No more sacrifices." I paused, hands shaking over the page. Calloway leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "You really think this will work?" I looked up at her, my eyes burning with a fire I didn't know I still had. "It has to," I said, "or we become them, echoes in the dark. I won't let that happen again." A beat of silence, then she nodded, her chin trembling. "Then I'll help," she said. "I'll follow the rules. I'll make sure everyone does." I let out a shaky laugh, the sound raw and strange. "You sure?" I asked. "Once you start down this path, there's no going back. The forest doesn't forgive." She met my gaze head on. "I'm sure," she said. For the first time in what felt like centuries, I felt something bloom in my chest, a fragile, stubborn spark of hope. I tore the page out of the notebook and pressed it into her hands. "Make copies," I said. "Burn them into every ranger's mind. Pin them to every wall, every outpost. These aren't just rules, they're our lifeline." She took the page like it was a holy relic, holding it close to her chest. As she turned to leave, I looked back at the lantern. The flame pulsed, and, for a split second, I saw 1,000 eyes staring back at me from its depths. I didn't flinch. Instead, I whispered to it, my voice low and fierce, "Watch me." And for the first time, it felt like it listened. 2 days later, I stood at the edge of the tree line, lantern in one hand, knife strapped tight to my thigh. Calloway stood beside me, her shoulders rigid, her eyes locked on the forest ahead, as if she could will it to behave. Behind her, 3 more rangers waited, young, wary, each clutching their gear like it might evaporate if they let go. I turned to him, feeling the air tighten in my lungs. "Remember the new rules," I said, my voice echoing off the pines. "No one breaks formation. No one answers voices. If anyone hears their name, you stop and confirm. Face, hands, full body. You trust nothing else." They all nodded, eyes wide and unblinking. I raised the lantern. The flame inside flared, a ripple of blue light cutting through the morning fog. I stepped forward first. The forest accepted me like an old lover, arms open, breath sweet and rotting. 1,000 phantom eyes pressed against my skin, watching, waiting. Every branch, every pile of moss felt charged with hidden life, as if the basin itself was holding its breath to see what I would do. Calloway followed close behind, boots crunching on the damp earth. The others moved in a tight line, their radios crackling softly, each step heavy with the weight of the unknown. About 100 yards in, I stopped. A circle of stones lay ahead, perfectly symmetrical, half hidden beneath the moss. A thin mist curled above it, shimmering like heat off asphalt. Calloway's breath hitched behind me. "The circles," she whispered. I nodded. "They're boundaries. Gates. We used to ignore them or avoid them. Not anymore." I crouched and pulled a piece of bright orange survey tape from my pocket, wrapping it around a nearby pine. Then I pulled out a small can of spray paint and marked the stones with a large, bold X. Calloway leaned forward, her fingers trembling. "You're marking it?" she asked, her voice somewhere between awe and horror. "Yes," I said. "The basin thrives in secrecy. We starve it with exposure." I stood, turning to the others. "This is the first of many," I said. "If you find a circle, you mark it, you map it, you log every detail. The forest loses power every time we name its hiding places." A low wind shivered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, almost childlike giggle. One of the younger rangers, Miller, barely 20, stiffened, his eyes going glassy. "Mom?" he croaked, stepping toward the sound. Calloway lunged forward, grabbing his arm. "Hold formation," she shouted. Miller thrashed, wild and sudden. "She's here! Hear her!" I moved fast, dropping the lantern to the ground and pinning his shoulders. His eyes rolled, tears streaking down his dirt-streaked cheeks. "It's not her," I snarled into his face. "It will never be her, do you understand me?" His mouth opened, a broken sob tearing free. Calloway grabbed his hand and squeezed hard, her voice shaking. "We're here, we're real, listen to us." After a long, ragged moment, he slumped, his breath hitching. I let go, scooping up the lantern. The flame inside pulsed like a living heart. I scanned the tree line, my eyes searching for movement. "Stay sharp," I growled. "It's testing us." Calloway helped Miller back into line, her hand never leaving his arm. We moved deeper. Twice more we found circles. One made of bones, another of blackened twigs arranged in a spiraling pattern. Each time I marked them, each spray-painted X a small victory. The forest hated us for it. I could feel its fury in every gust of wind, every creaking branch. Voices called from every direction, pleading, mocking, begging. We didn't answer. At one point we crossed a shallow stream. Calloway hesitated at the water's edge, her reflection rippling beneath her. I stepped beside her, raising the lantern to the surface. In the water, our reflections shifted and twisted. Extra limbs, hollow eyes, mouths that stretched into inhuman smiles. Calloway gagged, stumbling back. I turned to her, my voice hard. "This is its last defense," I said. "It's not real. Remember who you are." She nodded, wiping her mouth with a trembling hand. We kept moving. Eventually, we reached a clearing I knew too well. The one with the stone altar where I had faced the basin's heart. The altar still stood, but the black pool was gone, replaced by a shallow pit filled with dead leaves. I stepped forward, the others fanning out cautiously behind me. I placed the lantern on the altar, its flame burning brighter than ever. I turned to face them, my hands curling into fists at my sides. "This is where it ends," I said. "This is where we take back our forest." Miller shivered, but his eyes held firm. Calloway stepped forward, her voice strong despite the tremor running through it. "What now?" she asked. I looked at each of them in turn. Young, scared, but here. "We hold it accountable," I said. "We keep walking these woods, keep marking its circles, keep telling the stories. We turn every hidden horror into something seen, something known, and when it tries to take us, we take it right back." A heavy silence settled over the clearing. Then Calloway raised her radio and spoke, her voice cutting through the hush. "Base, this is Team Echo. We're clear. Mark the map for new boundaries. We'll be back tomorrow." A long pause crackled on the line before a voice answered. "Copy that, Echo. We're standing by." She lowered the radio and met my eyes. I felt something move in my chest, a slow surge of fierce pride. I turned back to the lantern. "Watch us," I whispered to it. "We're not your prey anymore." The flame pulsed once, like a heartbeat in the dark. Then I picked it up, and stepped off the altar, leading my team back into the trees, each footstep an act of defiance against the basin's long, silent reign. We returned to base at dusk, our boots caked in mud, our clothes soaked through from mist and sweat. The compound looked different now, smaller somehow, as though the forest had crept closer while we were gone. Shadows gathered at the edges of the lot, shifting in that old, predatory way. As we crossed the last stretch of dirt, a handful of rangers waited on the porch. Some had their hands shoved into their pockets, heads low, avoiding our eye. Others stared openly at the lantern in my hand, expressions torn between awe and terror. Calloway climbed the steps first, her shoulders squared despite her exhaustion. "We marked 3 new circles today," she called out, her voice firm. "Locked them all. No breaches." A ripple of whispers spread through the group. Abel stepped forward, his face pale and lined deeper than before. He scanned each of us, eyes lingering on Miller. The young ranger stood stiffly at the back, his face gray, eyes hollow but resolute. Abel finally turned to me. "Is it working?" he asked, voice hoarse. I looked at the lantern. The blue flame flickered gently, steady and confident. "It's a start," I said. "But the basin won't give up. It will adapt. We have to stay ahead of it, keep learning, keep pushing." He nodded slowly, but I could see the weight of my words crush into his shoulders like a landslide. Behind him, a young ranger raised his hand hesitantly. His name tag read Reyes. "What happens if someone breaks a rule?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. I met his eyes. "They don't come back," I said flatly. "Or worse, they come back wrong." A shudder ran through the group. Silence settled like heavy snow. Finally, Abel stepped aside, opening the doorway into the lodge. "Get inside," he said. "Eat, rest. We'll talk strategy in the morning." I led the way in, the lantern still held high. Inside, the mess hall was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and reheated soup. Calloway dropped into a chair, head falling into her hands. Miller slid into the seat across from her, staring blankly at the table. I set the lantern in the center. Its glow spread across the room, painting their tired faces in spectral blue. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Calloway looked up. "Did you ever think," she said slowly, "that maybe we shouldn't fight it? Maybe we should just leave, burn it all down and run?" I felt my jaw tighten. "I thought about it every day since I first stepped into Echo Basin," I admitted, "but running won't work. You can't outrun something that lives in your blood, your bones. You leave today, it follows you tomorrow. The only way out is through." Miller swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "And what if we fail?" he asked, voice small. I leaned forward, my fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Then at least we die on our feet," I said. "Not as offerings, not as echoes." A long silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the tick of the wall clock and the distant creak of the compound's frame settling in the wind. Reyes, who had followed us in, stepped closer. "I want to learn," he said suddenly. His hands shook, but his eyes were steady. "Teach me the new rules. Teach me the circles. I don't want to be in the dark anymore." I stood, pain flashing through my stitched side, but I embraced it. I picked up the lantern and turned it so its light fell directly on Reyes's face. "Are you ready to face it?" I asked. "Truly face it. The voices, the shapes, the things you thought only existed in stories told to scare you as a kid?" He nodded once, sharp and final. I looked at Calloway and Miller. "You're witnesses," I said. "You saw the heart with me. You know what it takes. If we're going to survive this, we need to train them. All of them." Calloway straightened slowly, her jaw firming. "I'll start drafting the drills," she said. "Tracking, circle mapping, formation discipline. We'll do it in teams of 3 always. No more lone patrols." Miller raised his head, his eyes clearer now than they had been all day. "I can teach them about the voices," he said. "How they get inside your head, how they feel real." I nodded, pride and sorrow tangling in my chest like brambles. "That's the spirit," I said. The door behind us opened, and Abel stepped in, his face drawn and tired. He carried a thick folder in one hand, papers spilling out at the corners. He tossed it onto the table. "Old case files," he said. "Disappearances, strange sightings, ranger journals we never published. Maybe there's something in here that can help you." I pulled the folder closer, flipping it open. The pages smelled like mildew and smoke, each one a ghost of a past nobody wanted to claim. Sketches of strange symbols, photos of partial footprints, reports of voices in the dark. I felt the lantern's heat grow beside me, as though it recognized the fragments of its own history. I looked up at Abel. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded once, shoulders sagging, before turning to leave. Calloway reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on mine. "We'll make this work," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "We have to." I tightened my grip around her fingers. "We will," I promised. The lantern flickered then, casting wild shadows that danced across the walls. For a moment, it felt like the entire lodge leaned in, listening. I closed the folder and stood, lifting the lantern. "Tomorrow," I said, my voice echoing off the walls, "we begin the hollow trial." Miller frowned. "What's that?" I turned, the blue light flickering across my scarred face. "It's the first real test," I said. "We lead a new team into the heart of the basin. We let them see the truth. We break them before the forest can, and we see who comes out stronger." Calloway's face paled, but she nodded. I stepped toward the door, the lantern burning like a captured star in my hand. As I opened it, a cold gust swept through, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. I looked back at them one last time. "Get some sleep," I said. "Tomorrow, we hunt the dark." Then I stepped outside, into the waiting night, the flame pulsing against my ribs like a second heart. The forest was different at night, not just darker, but alive in a way that felt older than language, older than bones. Every breath of wind carried whispers, every shifting shadow a half-formed threat. I stood at the edge of the tree line, lantern in one hand, knife in the other. Behind me, Calloway, Miller, Reyes, and two rookies, Holt and Jansen, waited in a tight, nervous knot. Tonight was the first hollow trial, the final test before we unleashed the new rules on the entire ranger force. The first chance to prove that knowing the forest's true face wouldn't break them. I turned to face them. "Final checks," I called. My voice cut across the clearing like a blade. "Knives, radios, marking gear?" They all nodded, fumbling to touch each item strapped to their vests, as if reassuring themselves they still existed in the real world. Calloway stepped forward, eyes locked on mine. "You sure about this?" she asked quietly, too low for the others to hear. I looked past her into the black maze of trunks and fog. The lantern flame burned steady, its blue glow reflecting in my eyes like moonlight on water. "We don't have a choice," I said. "They have to see it. They have to survive it with their minds intact, or the basin will eat them alive the moment they hesitate." She swallowed hard and nodded, stepping back into formation. I raised the lantern. The flame pulsed once, as though exhaling. "Stay close," I ordered. "If you lose sight of the flame, drop and shout. We don't run blind." With that, I stepped forward, crossing into the forest. The others followed, boots crunching over wet needles and half-frozen mud. We moved slow, our formation tight as a heartbeat. The lantern's light carved a narrow corridor through the darkness, casting long, warped shadows that writhed like living things. Holt stumbled first. His boot snagged a root, and he dropped to one knee, cursing. I spun, grabbing his shoulder. "Eyes up," I snapped. "You trip, you die. Simple as that." He looked up at me, his breath ragged clouds in the cold air. His face was pale, sweat already pooling along his hairline. "Yes, ma'am," he gasped. I let him go and kept moving. The first circle appeared about 20 minutes in, a perfect ring of bones, some bleached white, others still slick with old sinew. Reyes's breath hitched. "What the fuck?" he whispered. I knelt and marked the perimeter with spray paint, the X dark and orange against the bones. "This is where it starts to test you," I said, standing. "Your mind, your faith in each other. Stay close." We pressed on. The deeper we went, the thicker the fog grew, clinging to us like damp cloth. Voices began to rise in the dark, fragmented whispers that slipped between the trees like thin knives. Miller flinched beside me, his fingers tightening on his blade. "It's trying to split us," he muttered. "I can feel it." I nodded. "Let it talk," I said, "but don't answer. Ever." A shape flickered ahead, tall, thin, moving between trunks with a boneless grace. Jansen gasped, his radio crackling as his hands spasmed around it. "It's Liam," he shouted. "Jesus, he's alive!" He broke formation, lunging toward the shape. "No!" I roared. I surged forward, lantern swinging wildly, light flaring across the undergrowth. The shape turned. For a moment it did look like Liam, his wide eyes, his crooked grin. But when it opened its mouth, the grin split ear to ear, revealing a black void that swallowed the light. Jansen froze, his scream stuck in his throat. I grabbed his vest and yanked him backward. The mimic lunged, its arms splitting into long, jointless whips that slapped against the dirt where Jansen had stood seconds before. I shoved him back toward the others. "Formation!" I shouted. They closed ranks, their eyes wide and wild. The mimic hissed, its empty face contorting into a jagged parody of a human smile before it melted into the fog. I turned on Jansen, my chest heaving. "Break the line again and I leave you here," I snarled. "Understand?" He nodded, tears streaming down his face. I forced the lantern higher. The flame flared in answer, pushing back the fog a few feet more. We kept moving. Every step felt like moving through a nightmare that had grown teeth. The voices shifted from whispers to shouts, some screaming my name, others calling to the others in the exact voices of their loved ones. Holt staggered beside me, his head jerking from side to side. "Mom! Dad!" he whimpered. I slammed my free hand against his helmet, snapping his head back to face me. "They're not here," I roared. "You hear me? They are not here." His eyes cleared for a split second, then he nodded, breath ragged, and locked eyes on my lantern. We pressed deeper until the trees began to thin and the earth turned soft under our boots, sucking at our steps. We entered a hollow ringed by ancient pines, each trunk marked with deep, claw-like gouges. The ground was covered in black moss that seemed to twitch as we passed. At the center stood a new circle, this one of stones, slick with something dark that glistened under the lantern's glow. I moved to the edge and planted the lantern in the dirt. "Circle up," I commanded. They formed a tight ring around me, backs to each other, blades drawn. "This is the heart of tonight's trial," I said, my voice echoing. "The basin will come for you here. It will show you your worst fears, your deepest wants. Your job is to hold the line and remember who you are." "Who we are." Silence. Then Calloway spoke, voice strong and steady. "We are the Watchers," she said. Miller joined in. "We are the Shield." Reyes's voice wavered but held. "We mark the dark." Holt and Jansen echoed together, trembling. "We come back, whole." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, not from fear, but from something older, something almost holy. I drew my knife and turned toward the forest's edge. "Then let it come," I whispered. As if on cue, the fog roared inward, shapes tearing free from the trees, all teeth and claws and hollow eyes. I raised the lantern, the flame exploding into a blinding pillar of blue light, and together we braced for the storm. The first creature hit the circle like a freight train. It lunged from the fog, a blur of twisted limbs and glistening black flesh. Its mouth split wide, lined with rows of needle-like teeth that clicked in a frenzy as it slammed into the barrier of blue light. The lantern's flame roared in response, flaring so bright I had to squint. The creature screeched, a sound so sharp it felt like nails clawing down the inside of my skull. "Play the line!" I shouted. My voice tore from my throat, raw and ragged. Miller stumbled to my left, eyes wide, blade raised. Another shape lunged at him, but Calloway pivoted, slamming her knife into its shoulder. The creature shrieked and evaporated into a spray of oily mist. "They're coming through!" Holt screamed. "Then push back harder!" I roared, swinging my blade at a figure that crawled in low, its body moving like a centipede made of human torso. It hissed, clawing at the ground, but the lantern's light burned its skin, leaving scorched trails of black. I stomped forward, my foot smashing into its skull, the impact vibrating up my leg. Reyes held his ground beside me, shaking violently. A shape lunged at him, this one wearing the face of a young woman, eyes wide and pleading. "Don't listen!" I screamed, but Reyes hesitated. The mimic lunged, its jaw unhinging wide enough to swallow his head whole. Without thinking, I drove my knife into its side, twisting until the creature howled and crumpled into a heap of ash and bone. Reyes fell to his knees, sobbing. I saw her," he gasped. I grabbed his vest and yanked him to his feet. "It's not her," I spat. "It will never be her. You stand or you die." His eyes focused on me, wild but present. He nodded, choking back another sob. Another wave crashed against us, shapes slithering and lunging, their forms shifting between human and something ancient and monstrous. Calloway held her ground like a wall, her blade sweeping in brutal arcs, her face a mask of rage and grief. Beside her, Miller chanted under his breath, each word a lifeline as he parried claws and teeth. I swung my blade again and again, each strike an act of defiance. Blood, black and tar-thick, splattered my arms and face, but I didn't stop. A sudden force slammed into my back, knocking me to my knees. My knife skittered across the ground, just out of reach. Before I could crawl forward, a shape loomed over me. A mimic wearing my father's face. "Erica," it crooned, voice a sick echo of his warmth. "You don't have to fight. Just come home." I felt the words slither into my ears, soft and sweet. A lullaby laced with poison. I reached for the lantern. The mimic knelt, its cold fingers brushing my cheek. "We miss you," it whispered. "We're waiting." My fingers closed around the lantern's handle. I looked up into its hollow eyes, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might shatter. "Not today," I growled. I swung the lantern up, smashing it into its face. The flame erupted, washing over the mimic in a blinding wave of blue fire. The creature howled, its skin bubbling and peeling away as it crumbled into ash. I staggered to my feet, retrieving my knife. Around me, my team pressed closer, forming a tight circle, their eyes locked on the flame. Calloway's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "We hold this ground," she screamed. "We hold it together." Miller's voice rose beside hers, each word a hammer striking steel. "We are not your prey," Reyes joined in, his voice shaking but fierce. "We mark the dark," Holt and Jansen, pale and blood-splattered, echoed together. "We come back whole." I stepped into the center, the lantern raised high, its flame roaring like a living thing. "You hear that?" I bellowed into the dark. "We are not yours. This ends here." A new wave charged us, larger, faster, a storm of limbs and teeth and echoing voices. I surged forward to meet them, blade and lantern moving as one. Every swing cut deeper, every burst of blue light seared holes into their shifting forms. Calloway moved beside me, her knife flashing in brutal arcs, her eyes locked on the nightmare shapes as if daring them to come closer. Miller's roars became a rhythm, a heartbeat we all moved to. Reyes pressed forward, his blade trembling but steady, while Holt and Jansen held the flanks, pushing back every claw that scraped at their armor. Minutes felt like hours. The air thickened with ash and smoke, the forest echoing with inhuman screams and our ragged war cries. Then, slowly, the waves began to falter. The creatures hesitated, pulling back, their shapes flickering and collapsing like dying sparks. I pressed forward, slashing into the last few stragglers, driving them back beyond the tree line. One final shape lingered, its form half-formed, flickering between faces. Liam, Harris, my father. I locked eyes with it, my knife raised. It hesitated, its hollow mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Then, with a final shudder, it dissolved into the fog, leaving only silence behind. I stood panting, the lantern still burning bright. Behind me, my team staggered forward, eyes wide and gleaming in the blue light. Calloway dropped to her knees, head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I turned to face him, every inch of me trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. "We survived," I said, my voice hoarse. "And we made the forest bleed." Miller let out a strangled laugh, tears cutting trails through the grime on his cheeks. Reyes looked up at me, his voice cracking. "What now?" he asked. I lifted the lantern higher, its flame pulsing like a living heartbeat. "Now," I said, "we take it all back." And in the hollow, surrounded by ash and echoes, we stood together, scarred, battered, but unbroken. We didn't move for a long time. The hollow felt like the eye of a hurricane, quiet, heavy, charged with a strange static that set my teeth on edge. Fog drifted around us in thin, searching fingers, curling around our boots and sliding up our legs like curious snakes. I stood in the center, lantern still high. The blue flame was calmer now, almost serene, casting a gentle glow across our battered faces. Miller dropped his blade first, the metal clattering against the mossy ground. He fell to his knees, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. Reyes stumbled backward, propping himself against a tree, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Holt and Jansen leaned into each other, as if afraid they might disappear if they let go. Calloway rose from her knees, blood smudging her cheek, eyes red and swollen. But when she looked at me, there was no fear, only a burning, defiant resolve. I lowered the lantern, my own arms trembling with exhaustion. "We made it through the night," I said, my voice raw and quiet. "That was the basin's first true retaliation. It won't stop here." Calloway wiped her face with her sleeve. Her jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles jumping beneath her skin. "That we keep pushing," she said, voice hoarse but unwavering. "We don't let it recover. We don't let it breathe." I nodded, my fingers tightening around the lantern's handle. I turned to the others. "Check in," I ordered. "Sound off." Miller raised his head first, eyes wide and haunted but alive. "Still here," he croaked. Reyes lifted a shaking hand. "Alive," he rasped. Holt and Jansen echoed together, voices low but certain. "We're here." I turned my eyes to the tree line. The fog had begun to pull back, creeping deeper into the forest like a wounded animal licking its wounds. "Listen to me," I said, stepping into their circle. "This was the first time we took the fight to it. We pushed back, marked its ground, forced it to show its hand. But it's not dead. It's watching, learning, planning." Miller swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "How do we kill something that old?" he asked, voice cracking. I looked down at the lantern. The blue flame pulsed, slow and steady, as if it were listening. "We don't kill it in one blow," I said. "We starve it. We cut away its hiding places. We turn its secrets into stories, its darkness into light. We make it so it has nowhere left to crawl." A long silence followed. Then Calloway stepped forward and touched my arm. "And if it fights back harder next time?" she asked. I met her eyes. "Then we fight harder," I said. "And if we fall, we make sure the next person picks up the lantern and keeps going." A flicker of something almost like a smile passed across her face. "We will," she whispered. "We will." I turned toward the altar stone at the center of the hollow. Its surface was streaked with old blood and moss, and the deep carvings glowed faintly under the lantern's light. I stepped up to it, running my fingers over the cold grooves. "They used this place for sacrifices," I said softly, more to myself than to them. "They fed it here, over and over. Every name in those missing files, every ranger who disappeared, they ended here." Calloway moved to my side, her breath shallow. "So what do we do with it now?" she asked. I raised the lantern above the stone. "We reclaim it," I said. "We turn the heart of its ritual into the heart of our resistance." I motioned for the others to gather around. "Put your hands on the stone," I ordered. They hesitated, exchanging wary glances. "Trust me," I said, my voice low but sharp as a blade. One by one they stepped forward, each placing a trembling hand on the altar's rough surface. When they were all in place, I pressed my palm flat against the stone and lowered the lantern until it hovered just above it. The blue flame flared, bathing us in a searing light. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a deep vibration rolled up through the stone, humming into our bones. The forest shivered around us, branches groaning, the ground trembling like something massive shifting in its sleep. I closed my eyes, focusing on the warmth radiating up my arm, the pulse of the flame merging with the beat of my own heart. Images flashed behind my eyelids, echoes of every soul the basin had consumed, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching out from black water, mouths open in silent screams. But beneath the horror, I felt something else. A spark. A memory of what they once were. Rangers, hikers, hunters, innocents. Not prey, people. I opened my eyes. "We speak their names," I said, my voice vibrating with something old and powerful. "We call them back into the light." Miller was the first to speak, his voice trembling. "Liam Sawyer." Calloway followed, her voice rising strong. "Harris Monroe." Reyes, Holt, and Jansen joined, each name a blow against the dark. I added my father's name last, the sound of it almost breaking me in half. David Nolan. The lantern's flame blazed upward, a column of blue fire that roared into the sky, lighting the trees in a ghostly glow. The vibration under our palms turned into a deep, resonant thrum, like a heartbeat echoing through the earth. The forest around us fell silent. For one impossible moment, I felt all those lost souls, watching, listening. I pressed my forehead to the stone, tears spilling onto the moss. "You are not forgotten," I whispered. "Not anymore." When I pulled back, the flame had settled again, small but fiercer than before. I looked at my team, their faces tear-streaked and shining in the lantern's glow. "This is the beginning," I said. "From now on, every patrol, every circle we mark, every story we tell, this is for them." Calloway stepped forward and laid her forehead against mine. "For them," she echoed. And in that sacred silence, as the first hint of false dawn crept through the trees, we stood together, 5 bloodied, broken souls who refused to vanish into the dark. We left the hollow just as the first fake dawn bled through the trees. The pale glow didn't feel like morning. It felt like a trick, an illusion stitched together by something that wanted us to think we were safe. The real sun wouldn't rise here, not yet. The forest still held too many deaths, too many echoes. We moved in a tight formation, blades and lantern raised, eyes scanning every shifting shadow. The fog clung low to the ground, curling around our ankles like cold hands trying to pull us under. Calloway walked beside me, her breath ragged but steady. Every few steps, she glanced at the lantern, as if to reassure herself the flame was still there, still burning. Behind us, Miller, Reyes, Holt, and Jansen trudged forward in heavy silence. Their faces were pale, streaked with ash and dried blood, but their eyes, they were sharper now, hardened. After what felt like hours, we reached the trailhead. The old sign still leaned crookedly, its mossy surface bearing the carved word that had haunted me since my first step inside: "Run." I stopped, staring at it, the lantern casting its glow across the letters. I felt the others gather around me, their breathing heavy in the stillness. Calloway stepped forward and drew her knife. Without a word, she slashed a deep X through the word "Run." The blade scraped through rotted wood with a screech that echoed into the trees. When she stepped back, the cut stood out like a fresh scar, bold, defiant. "We don't run anymore," she said, voice low but fierce. I looked at her, and something inside me shifted. Pride, relief, a flicker of hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel for too long. I pressed my hand to the new mark, feeling the rough splinters bite into my palm. "No," I echoed. "We fight. We stand." Rhea stepped forward next, raising a can of bright orange spray paint we'd used to mark circles. He shook it once, twice, then scrawled a new word beneath the X. Remember. The can hissed and spat, leaving uneven letters that glowed under the lantern's blue light. Silence followed, heavy and sacred. I turned to the group, my voice barely above a whisper. This is our first message to the forest, I said. It won't like it, it will retaliate, but this is how we start breaking it, word by word, circle by circle. Holt let out a shaky breath. How do we prepare for that? For what comes next? I scanned each of them in turn, searching their faces for any crack, any falter. But they stood firm, their gazes locked on mine. We write the new rules, I said. Not just for us, but for every ranger, every future recruit, every person who might one day find themselves standing where we are now. We give them a map, a guide, a fighting chance. Jansen stepped forward, voice quivering. Even if it kills us? I nodded. Especially if it kills us, I said. A hush settled again, broken only by the soft hiss of the lantern. Calloway reached for her radio, lifting it to her lips. Base, this is Echo Team, she said. Her voice shook at first, then strengthened with each word. We're returning. Status, mission complete. We have new protocols to debrief. A burst of static, then a voice crackled through, Abel's, thin and disbelieving. Copy that, Echo Team. Repeat, you're alive? Calloway glanced at me, then back at the forest. We're alive, she said firmly, and we're coming back with fire. A long pause followed. Then, understood, we're ready. She lowered the radio, her hands trembling slightly. I stepped up to her, placing my free hand on her shoulder. You did good, I said. She gave a small, tired laugh. No, we did good. Miller moved closer, dropping to one knee and pulling a small battered notebook from his pocket. The same one we'd found in the old ranger cabin, filled with scribbled warnings and half-legible rituals. He opened it to a blank page and looked up at me. What do we call this? He asked. This movement, this fight. I looked at the lantern flame. It flickered once, twice, almost as if it were waiting. Call it the Hollow Watch, I said. We are the watchers in the Hollow. We see it, we name it, we don't run. Miller wrote the words slowly, each letter carved in his shaky hand like a promise. When he finished, he held the page up. The words glowed faintly under the lantern's light. Calloway stepped forward again, pressing her palm to the notebook. For Liam, she said. Miller echoed her. For Harris. Reyes's voice joined, a whisper. For the Forgotten. Holt and Jansen added their hands, faces set in grim, determined lines. I pressed my hand last, the warmth of their palms bleeding into mine. For every echo, I said, every soul it tried to erase. We stood there, our hands layered, the word Hollow Watch burning between us like a brand. A sudden gust rolled out from the trees, cold and sharp as a blade. The lantern flared in my hand, a swirl of blue and white rising like a ghostly cyclone before settling again. I felt the forest shiver around us, heard it breathe, hiss, retreat. It knew we were coming, and for the first time I felt it hesitate. I lifted the lantern high, the flame burning bright enough to rival the false dawn creeping across the horizon. We are not prey, I said, my voice carrying into the woods. We're the Watchers, and we are coming for you. Calloway drew her blade and held it high beside mine. Hollow Watch, she shouted. The others echoed, voices crashing together like thunder rolling across the ridge. Hollow Watch! I looked once more at the twisted tree line. I could almost see shapes shifting there, listening, learning, afraid. Then I turned to my team, the lantern blazing in my grip. Let's go home, I said. We have work to do. And together, under that sick, flickering dawn, we took the first steps back, toward the compound, toward new rules, toward the final war that waited beyond the dark. The compound came into view just as the true dawn finally broke across the sky. The sunlight looked almost unreal, pouring over the lodge roof in sheets of molten gold, but it felt thinner than it should, strained, as if it had to fight its way through layers of fog and unseen hands. We marched forward as one, dirty, bloodied but upright. Our boots hit the gravel in a steady, echoing rhythm that carried into the trees behind us. Abel stood at the edge of the porch, his arms folded tight across his chest, eyes wide. A small cluster of rangers gathered behind him, staring at us with a mix of fear, relief, and something new: respect. I stepped up first, the lantern still burning in my hand. Abel's gaze dropped to it, and I saw a flicker of realization move across his face. "You did it," he whispered. I shook my head. "No," I said. "We started it." Calloway moved to my side, her blade still smeared with black ash. She looked at Abel, her voice cutting through the morning stillness. "We're going to train them," she said. "All of them. No more half-truths, no more secrets. Every ranger will learn the real rules. We make every circle known. We mark every hidden echo." Abel stared at her, his mouth working soundlessly. Behind him, one of the rookie rangers stepped forward, young, barely 20, eyes wide and terrified. "What if it comes for us?" she asked, voice shaking. I turned to her, my eyes locking onto hers with a force that made her flinch. "It will," I said. "It already is, but this time we don't run. We don't hide. We face it together and we push it back until it has nowhere left to crawl." She looked at me for a long moment, then she nodded, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. I stepped up onto the porch, raising the lantern so the flame lit every face gathered there. "This is our final pact," I said, my voice filling the compound, rolling over the silent trucks, the watchtowers, the fading trails beyond the fence. "So, we are the Hollow Watch. We see the basin. We speak its names. We carry every lost soul on our backs, and we walk into the dark for them." Calloway drew her knife and raised it high beside me. "For Liam, for Harris, for every ranger that vanished believing they were alone," she shouted. The rookie ranger lifted her own blade, voice cracking but clear. "For them." One by one, more knives rose into the air. Some hands shook, some faces crumpled with tears, but every single one stayed raised. A low rumble rolled through the forest, as if the basin itself had heard us. The treetops shivered, and I felt a distant scream echo through the roots beneath my feet. It knew, and it was afraid. I lowered the lantern, stepping forward until I stood at the edge of the stairs. "This won't be the last fight," I said, my voice low but sharp. "It will try again. It will lure. It will mimic. It will offer us peace in exchange for silence. But we will not be silent." The group stood frozen, their eyes wide, breaths caught in their chests. I turned the lantern so they could see the flame clearly. "Every circle we mark weakens it," I said. "Every story we tell starves it. And every step we take forward is a step it cannot reclaim." A breeze rolled through, scattering loose dirt across the compound. The air smelled of pine, smoke, and something older, something that felt like the first breath after drowning. Calloway stepped closer to me, her forehead pressing lightly to mine. "We've got your back," she whispered. I let out a shuddering breath, closing my eyes for just a moment. When I opened them, I felt something inside me shift, something deep and ancient, like the tectonic plates beneath the forest. I raised the lantern one final time. "This is our forest now," I said, "ours. And we will watch it. We will guard it. We will burn its ghosts until only light remains." The rangers roared together, a sound so raw it felt like it could tear open the sky. "Hollow Watch!" I felt their voices rumble through me, down into the dirt, echoing through the hidden tunnels and black pools far below. The basin shivered again, a final pulse of rage and warning. But this time, it wasn't a predator's growl. It was a wounded animal's last hiss before retreat. I turned and handed the lantern to Calloway. "Your turn," I said, my voice rough. "Teach them. Lead them." She took it with both hands, her fingers curling around the handle like it was an extension of her own body. "I will," she said. I stepped back, turning to face the tree line one last time. In the wavering shadows, I thought I saw them. Liam, Harris, my father, their faces soft, their eyes calm, watching, waiting. I lifted my hand in a silent salute for them. A warmth spread through my chest, fierce and bittersweet. I turned back to my team, to the Rangers, to the future that waited like a thin blade on the horizon. I felt the first true sunrise break across my shoulders, washing me in gold and fire, and for the first time since stepping into Echo Basin, I felt whole. I stepped forward, into the light. The forest never truly sleeps. Even after the sun's warm fingers chased away the mist, even when the Rangers locked the gates behind them and the compound settled into a brittle silence, the shadows remained. I could feel them lurking just beyond the edge of vision, the faintest shift in the trees, the softest breath on my neck, the distant echo of a whisper curling around the pines like smoke. They had retreated, yes. The Hollow Watch had pushed them back, stamped their claim on the basin's dark heart, but the basin's hunger never truly died. On nights when the wind was still and the moon hung low, I could hear the forest's sigh, half promise, half warning. Erica, that voice. Sometimes it was my father's warm timbre, steady and sure. Other times it was Liam's frantic broken cry, a threadbare plea woven from fading memories. But more often it was something darker, something new. A whisper shaped from shadow and cold breath, teasing and coaxing and never quite revealing its true face. I had left the compound to my team. Calloway was now the keeper of the lantern, the beacon in the dark, the new heart of the Hollow Watch. But I was something else now. I walked the perimeter alone, lantern in hand, eyes peeled for the faintest sign of movement. I marked new circles with bright orange X's, each one a small defiance, a spark against the swallowing dark. The woods knew me now, and I knew them in return. I had learned their language, of cracks in the earth, of bones half buried beneath moss, of voices that could lull a man to sleep or shatter his mind in a heartbeat. One evening, as twilight bled into night, I found myself at the edge of a forgotten clearing. The fog curled low, silver and thick, weaving through the ancient oaks like a living thing. The lantern's blue flame flickered, casting dancing shadows across the gnarled roots. I knelt and traced a hand over the cracked stone of an old altar, moss soft beneath my fingers. And then I saw it. A single footprint. Not human, not quite animal. A print pressed deep into the soil, impossibly large and oddly shaped, half claw, half finger. My breath hitched. The forest was watching. I rose slowly, the lantern held high, a soft rustle from the underbrush. I spun, knife drawn, heart pounding a savage rhythm. Nothing. Only the whisper, soft as a lover's sigh, cold as a grave. Erica? The voice came again, closer this time. I stepped forward into the mist, and in that moment, I knew the fight wasn't over. It never would be, but now, I was ready. I was the Watcher, the keeper of the flame, the last light in the hollow, and I would never let it go out. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, but the forest's hunger never waned. Even as the Hollow Watch expanded its reach, patrols doubling, new circles mapped and marked, the basin's shadows deepened, stretching further into the lives of those who dared to challenge it. I felt it in every breath, every whisper, every flicker of the lantern's blue flame. They were watching, waiting. One night, weeks after the first hollow trial, I was alone on patrol, the world reduced to a tight cone of lantern light cutting through the suffocating darkness. The fog hung thick, a living curtain that clung to my skin and filled my lungs with cold, damp silence. I moved slowly, every step measured, every sense stretched taut. Then, just beyond the light's reach, I heard it. A soft scraping, like nails against bark. I froze. The air shifted. A shape emerged, tall, thin, impossibly silent. Its eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but with an absence of it. A void that swallowed everything in its gaze. I raised the lantern. the flame roaring to life, casting harsh shadows that flickered across the creature's twisted form. It smiled, a grotesque peeling grin that stretched far too wide. "Erica," it whispered, voice 1,000 fractured echoes all at once. My knife came up instinctively, but I didn't move forward. "I'm not yours," I said, voice steady despite the cold that crept along my spine. The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You belong to us," it said. "You carry the flame because you are made for it." I took a slow, deliberate breath. "No," I said. "I carry it because I choose to." The creature's form flickered, its grin faltering for a fraction of a second. "You are a bridge," it hissed, "a light that can never last. The basin will reclaim its own." I stepped forward, lantern held high, flame flaring bright enough to burn away the fog. "Then it will burn," I said, "and I will watch the ashes." The creature screamed, a shattering, piercing wail that echoed through the trees and rattled the very earth beneath my feet. But I stood my ground. I was no longer alone. Behind me, a chorus of voices rose. Calloway, Miller, Reyes, Holt, Jansen, each stepping into the circle of light, their own lanterns blazing, blades drawn. Together, we formed a wall of flame and steel, an unyielding barrier against the darkness. The creature lunged, a wave of shadows and claws, but the light held firm. We pushed it back, step by step, marking every retreating shadow, every broken circle, and as dawn finally broke, spilling pale gold across the trembling trees, I knew this was just the beginning. The shadows would deepen, the hunger would grow, but so would we. We were the Hollow Watch, the Watchers in the dark, the last light standing between the basin and the world, and we would never let that light go out. The deeper we dug into the basin's secrets, the heavier the weight on my chest grew. Every marked circle was a scar on the forest's skin, a wound that pulsed and bled with the memories of the lost. But scars don't heal overnight. One night, as the rain hammered against the compound's windows and the wind howled like a beast clawing at its cage, a knock came at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it to find Abel, soaked through, eyes dark with exhaustion and fear. "We've lost contact with the East Patrol," he said, voice grim. "They went in yesterday. No word since." I felt a cold knot twist inside me. "The Hollow trial?" I asked. He nodded. "We think so." Without hesitation, I grabbed the lantern, its blue flame steady and fierce. "We go at first light," I said. Calloway was already waiting, her face set in a mask of determination. "We bring them back," she said, "or what's left of them." The next day we moved out at dawn, the rain having softened the earth into slick, treacherous mud. The East Patrol's trail led us through thickets so dense sunlight barely touched the ground, where every snapped twig and rustle echoed like a gunshot. The first circle we found was new, an eerie ring of stones and feathers, slick with wetness. Calloway knelt and marked it with spray paint, her hands steady despite the chill seeping into her bones. "This is where they vanished," she said softly. We pressed on, tension mounting with each step. The deeper we went, the louder the whispers became, voices calling names, speaking in tongues, weaving lies and truths until the line between them vanished. Miller's grip tightened on his knife, his jaw clenched so hard I thought it might crack. "I'm not listening," he muttered. But the voices found him anyway. Holt stumbled suddenly, his eyes rolling back as a shadow slipped inside his mind. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back, shouting his name. He shook his head, gasping, and I knew he was fighting the pull. The clearing we entered next was soaked in a thick, unnatural fog. The ground was littered with twisted bones and shattered relics, remnants of the patrol we were hunting. Then, from the mist, figures emerged. The Lost Rangers. Their forms flickered between human and something else. Shadows stretched thin, faces half melted into masks of despair. Liam's eyes met mine. wide and pleading, the hollow echo of his voice whispering, "Help me." I raised the lantern, its flame roaring to life, burning away the fog and revealing the true horror beneath. The lost were not gone. They were trapped, held prisoner by the basin's hunger. Calloway stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "We have to free them," she said. I nodded, feeling the lantern's warmth spread through my cold fingers. "This is our sacrifice," I said, "our silence." We formed a circle around the trapped souls, chanting the names we had learned. The lost, the forgotten, the stolen. The forest around us responded, a chorus of wind and shadow, of whispers and screams, rising to a crescendo that shook the very ground beneath our feet. The fog lifted, the figures growing clearer, faces softening, eyes brightening, bodies becoming whole once more. One by one they stepped forward, freed from the basin's grasp. Liam was the last to come into the light, his smile faint but real. "We're not forgotten," he whispered. The rain ceased. The dawn broke clear and bright, but we knew the fight was far from over. We had paid the price. We had sacrificed our silence. And now the basin knew we were awake. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with a silence so heavy it pressed against my skin like water. The fog, once a ghostly veil that slipped between the trees, had grown into a solid, choking blanket. We stood at the edge of the basin's darkest heart, where the earth had cracked open and swallowed light whole. Calloway's hand was tight around the lantern, her knuckles white, her breath shallow but steady. Behind her, the team huddled close, Miller, Reyes, Holt, Jansen, each face drawn tight with exhaustion and fear. I stepped forward, the weight of the lantern grounding me like an anchor in a storm. "This is it," I said, voice low but fierce. "The final boundary." The forest didn't respond, but I could feel it watching, waiting. The ground beneath us trembled softly, a pulse that echoed through the soles of my boots and settled in my bones. I knelt and placed the lantern on the cracked stone altar, its blue flame flaring to life, bathing the clearing in a ghostly glow. "This flame," I said, "is our shield and our sword, the last light between us and the dark." Calloway stepped forward, her voice a whisper. "What now?" I looked into the flame, seeing reflections of every name we'd spoken, every lost soul we carried with us. "Now," I said, "we bind the basin's heart. We seal the broken circles and close the wounds. We make this place ours." Miller reached into his pack and pulled out a bundle of herbs, sage, cedar, juniper, tied with thin strips of leather. "We'll burn these," he said. "Cleanse the air, the ground, the spirit." We lit the bundle, smoke curling upward in thick spirals, carrying ancient scents that stirred memories deep in my chest. The fog thinned, swirling around us as if recoiling from the cleansing fire. Reyes laid out strips of chalk, drawing a vast circle around the altar, intricate symbols looping and weaving like spider silk. "We locked the boundary," he explained. "No creature can cross without our consent." Holt and Jansen stood guard, eyes sharp, blades ready. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every lost soul, every sacrifice, every whispered warning. "Together," I said, voice rising, "we hold the line." We joined hands, forming a ring around the altar, the lantern's blue flame at its heart. I closed my eyes, focusing on the flame's steady pulse, like a heartbeat, like a promise. The forest responded, a low rumble, a chorus of rustling leaves, distant calls that were not quite human. The circle glowed, chalk lines shimmering with ethereal light. The fog pushed against the boundary, clawing at the edges, but it held. A scream shattered the silence, a piercing, agonized howl from deep within the basin. I opened my eyes, seeing shadows twist and writhe beyond the circle, faces contorted in rage and despair. But the circle held. Calloway's grip tightened on my hand, her voice steady. "We're not alone," she said. "They're watching." I nodded, feeling the lantern's warmth seep into my veins, fueling a fierce resolve. "This is our home," I said, "our forest, our fight." The blue flame blazed brighter, a beacon in the dark, and as the night deepened, we stood firm, unbroken, unyielding, the last light between the basin and the world beyond. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the shadows of Blackwater Basin. This story isn't just about the dark woods or the unseen creatures lurking in the mist. It's about courage, resilience, and the light we carry even when the night feels endless. To every watcher out there who's faced their own fears, who stood their ground when everything seemed lost, you're not alone. If this story stirred something inside you, if it made your heart race or your skin crawl, then I've done my job. Because the power of a story isn't just in what it tells, but in what it makes us feel. Please like, share, and subscribe if you want more stories that thrill, haunt, and inspire. Your support means everything and helps keep these tales alive. Remember, the darkest places often hold the brightest lights, so keep watching, keep listening, and keep your lanterns burning. Until next time, stay safe out there, and beware the whispers in the dark.